Welcome to this Rail Human Factors Forum and to everybody who is joining us right now. My name's Fiona Kenvan. I'm the Manager of Human Factors Integration and Change at Metro Trains Melbourne. I'm also the current chair of the Industry Rail Human Factors Managers Group, which is made up of human factors representatives from the passenger and freight rail operators across the country who have all organised to bring you here today. Before we start, on behalf of myself and all of our presenters, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we're all respectively talking to you today. For me here in Melbourne, it is the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you are all joining us. We pay respects to elders past and present and to their cultural and spiritual connections to country and waters. We recognise that our trains move people every day across this country through a landscape that holds the footprints and stories of thousands of generations of Aboriginal communities. To kick us off, first of all, I'd like to introduce the CEO of RISSB, Damien White, who would like to say a few brief words of welcome. Hello, Damien.
Hi, Fiona, and thank you for that introduction. I was only talking to Fiona earlier this morning. RISSB does lots of things in industry. Not surprisingly, we're sort of pigeonholed into rail industry safety standards because that's what we're called. But of course, we bring industry together in forums like this. We'll provide the opportunity. You guys bring yourselves together and organise yourselves. And in talking to Fiona, I said, we have sort of what I call big bang events like our annual safety conference, which is fantastic, but that takes an enormous amount of effort to organise. It's a big investment by everyone who attends in terms of time. And then at the other extreme, we have our fortnightly webinars, which are, again, equally valuable, but there's nothing in between. So I am really keen to see how today goes. It's certainly something greater than the fortnightly webinars. Sorry, I can't get to, I'm in Melbourne today, but can't get to the networking event. But just to introduce, this forum in fact has come together because the Rail Human Factor Management Group identified a need for more opportunity for development across rail human factor specialists. And the focus of today is by rail human factors for rail human factors, the opportunity to learn from the applied experience of other human factor people to take that back to our own organisations. We welcome everyone here today who has an interest in human factors and ensuring rail organisations continue to benefit from human factor expertise to solve strategic problems, improve safety and performance outcomes and lead to better design for all rail end users. In terms of housekeeping, it is a very packed program today, so we'll quickly move into it. Just for participants, note, only the presenter and panelist video and audio will be active at any one time, but the chat is live. And so I certainly encourage people to use the chat. I'll use the same comment that I do in our webinars. Let's keep it respectful, which I'm sure will be the case. But it is, again, quite a transparent approach to use the chat for questions. Each session will be followed by a short period for questions, and encourage you to put the questions into the chat and we'll all do our best to get to them. If we miss anyone due to time, we can follow that up after the session. And there'll be 2 breaks, and please keep the time coming back from those breaks so you don't miss a thing. So thank you again, Fiona and the Human Factors Management Group for the initiative of bringing this together. As I said, really keen to see how it goes, and thank you again, and I'll hand back to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Damien. As Damien said, this forum came about through the HF Managers Group. So we meet a couple of times a year. It's a collection of people who are either responsible for human factors within their organisation or perhaps have been given human factors as part of a broader safety portfolio. And it's definitely a mix of human factors professionals as well as perhaps the non-HF people So today really is a focus on human factors at that RTO level, that rail transport operator level. We know there's obviously a lot of great work that's being done out there by human factors consultants, academics, but we really wanted to start the conversation looking at what we're already doing ourselves, but also to share that experience and some of those good outcomes with each other so that we can take it away in a really practical way and apply it within our organisations. But welcome to everybody. And thank you for joining us. So to kick us off today, I'd like to invite Alison Jemborowski from the Office of the National Rail Safety Regulator, who is going to give an opening address to us. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And thank you for the opportunity to provide the opening address this afternoon. Jen Alcock and I, who work in the Human Factors section of ONSA, really appreciate the invitation to participate and to introduce the afternoon. Now, for those of you who don't work in rail industry, ONSA is the Office of the National Rail Safety Regulator, and we regulate railway safety. So that's passenger railways, freight, light rail, trams, and tourist and heritage operators all across Australia. Now, there's been quite a history in terms of human factors in rail in Australia. And in order to look towards the future, we need to acknowledge the successes of the past. And there's been a long history of trailblazers in human factors who have contributed to the success of consideration of human factors in rail in Australia. And collectively, there is a vast number of years of experience at this webinar, many of who have undertaken human factors and ergonomics work in rail for decades and who have been pivotal in embedding human factors into design and engineering processes, as well as throughout safety management systems, including fatigue risk management, through to human factors in operation and maintenance. So let's spend the next 10 minutes or so just taking a quick trip down memory lane at the factors contributing to success. So let's start with the introduction of trains around the mid-1800s and our issue with the different size rail gauges. I just wanted to reflect on the fact that in terms of the pace of progress, that after agreeing to an interstate network in 1901, agreeing on the standard gauge in 1910, it was actually nearly 100 years later when the final section, the Melbourne to Adelaide section, finally converted to standard gauge in 1995. And the interoperability issues are even more relevant today, particularly for human factors. So let's stay in the 1990s because the pace picked up, rail reform began in earnest and human factors started to come into prominence. Now, accreditations at that time were based on the 1995 Australian Standard 4292 on railway safety management. There was not a great deal of human factors consideration in that, although human error is certainly mentioned in part one.
Sorry, Alison, you're just not sharing anything at the moment. Can you just check you're sharing your screen?
Ooh. My apologies for that. I clicked on the camera and the mic and didn't click across to the right properly. My apologies. So let's stay. So we're the 2004, the accreditation package. Now suddenly from the AS 4292, which was 1995, and the National Rail Safety Accreditation Package in 2004, there's a lot of human factors material included in the 2004 package. So that was a significant shift in that 9 years, largely due to several rail incidents that I'll touch on next. And I'm certain there are probably some in the audience who participated in the development of the package and wrote and influenced the content. Now, by 2006, AS 4292 had also been updated to include significant HF content. In 2007, the national model laws were introduced, and this is where we see the first publishing of the current human factors provision. 5 years later, the RSNL and the national regs came into force with the same provision. In 2013, ONSA commenced operations, and it took until 2019 for ONSA to become a fully fledged national regulator when the last of Victorian's rail transport operators transitioned across to the national law. So while all this took a period of nearly 30 years, there was significant influence from the human factors community, which has resulted in the law as it is today. Now, going backwards a bit here, I mentioned in 2004, the National Accreditation Package had significant human factors content, and one of the reasons for this was two incidents that I'm going to touch on. First, the incident in 1999 with the incident at Glenbrook, where the interurban train collided with the rear of the Indian Pacific train, and it resulted in significant loss of life. Now, the incident resulted in a special commission of inquiry in 2001, And you can see here one of the quotes that there was a significant shift towards the consideration of human factors, because it was pointing to the importance of human factors, organisational and managerial issues, the development and maintenance of a strong safety culture as being matters that were fundamentally important to the proper management of safety. So this was a pivotal moment with regard to human factors, although the incident at Waterfall also played a large part. And of course, that happened in 2003, just 4 years later, where the driver and 6 passengers were fatally injured. The driver had become incapacitated after a cardiac event, and the train continued to gain speed and derailed going around a bend. Now, Justice McInerney, who was the same justice who did the previous one, he conducted another special commission of inquiry, and human factors came to the fore again with a focus on human factors and systems. And you can see there that he talks about the process of risk analysis requiring an understanding of the particular features of the whole system. And that requires appreciation of what makes the system work in terms of human factors, equipment, infrastructure, and the relationships between them. And he also found what we often now refer to as work as done compared to work as imagined, which is whatever the documentation claims, the reality was different. And recommendations were also made to include human factors considerations in risk management and design processes. So let's switch up the timeline because an awful lot has happened in terms of human factors work in industry that between 2005 and the present day. And the next few slides are just a quick synopsis of a guidance material with considerable human factors content that's been produced from a number of sources, starting with the regulators. And several of you have spent time either at the state regulators or at ONSA, and many of you have participated in producing guidance under the regulators' banners. So here is a taste of some of the work that's been done, starting with something many of you will be familiar with, the rail resource management, followed by version 1 and version 2 of the contributing factors framework, noting that both of them are still available on our website at the moment. In 2011, ITSA, or the Independent Transport Safety Regulator in New South Wales, had guides related to worksite protection and managing signals passed at danger. And in 2013, the first version of the preparation of the Rail Safety Management System guideline came out, followed by the Major Projects Guideline. In 2016, a road rail vehicle document with a human factors observations came out, and another one, a guideline on investigation reports to be done by rail transport operators. 2019 saw the SMS guideline and the Major Projects guideline both updated, and more recently, in 2020, the production of the ONSA Fatigue Risk Management Guideline. And now I'm going on to RISSB, and just a small taste of the Australian standards and guidance that has significant human factors content over the last 15 years, starting with 2008 with the Safety Culture Hub, which is still online today. And then there were things like the Fatigue Risk Management Guideline, the SPAD Risk Management Guideline, the Rail Safety Investigation Code of Practice. And then we're talking about a significant Australian Standard 7631 on signal sighting was developed, followed by AS 7470, which is about human factors integration into engineering design, which was a really significant piece of work. And 10 years later, that was complemented with a guideline. So more guidance followed, such as on safety critical communication and the guideline for integration of human factors across the project lifecycle. In 2021, AS 7533 on driving cabs was consolidated from several separate standards which had been produced in 2013. And more recently, in 2023, RISSB published the guideline Achieving a Positive Safety Culture in the Rail Corridor. Now, I'm well aware that this is just a really small snippet of the work that many of you in the audience have participated in, because I haven't included all the other standards and guidelines that have included portions of human factors within them, but there's a huge number of them, which really demonstrates the influence of the human factors community. And then there's the research done through all the universities and through a lot of the grants. And I've tried to cover just a representative sample of the work done by Australians and people in Australia that have been done over the last 15 years. And you can see the broad range of topics, from fatigue to contributing factors in incidents through to control rooms, safety culture, wayfinding, driver-only operations, track protection. And it continues on, looking at work in systems-based approaches to understanding safety management, signals passed at danger, lookout working, authority gradients, visibility of freight trains, which was one of the most recent guides out through ACRI, or now the National Transport Research Organisation. And I think that what the volume of work that many of you have participated in and continue to participate in shows a number of things. One is that human factors in rail covers a really wide and diverse range of topics. And secondly, that you are all very generous with your time and expertise. So looking back over the last 30 years, what does success look like? Well, I think success to date has really come from the recognition of human factors and ergonomics in all parts of the rail environment, which has also led to the growing body of human factors ergonomics professionals in rail, and not just at the operators, but also within the HF consultancies and engineering consultancies and within government organisations. Collaboration and consultation, it's at the core of our profession, and it really continues to be inspiring. And it's also here that I want to call out the two particular groups. Firstly, the HF Managers Group, which is putting on this forum today with RISSB. The group's been integral to the development of a lot of guidance, and also they've been very helpful as a group for consultation and collaboration with us at ONZA. And Jen and I would like to recognise the group for allowing us to consult and collaborate regarding the ONZA HF strategy, and more recently for the development of question sets that we're proposing to add to the upcoming ONZA HF web pages. Stay tuned for that one. And the second group is the Fatigue Risk Management Collaboration Group, which was formed in 2020, and you'll hear more about them later. But it's also the collaboration between industry, the regulator, and research, which brings with it a diversity of thought and a place to discuss a lot of the emerging issues. Another point, I think, is the advocacy, because there's been an incredible amount of advocacy that the human factors community conducts at all levels, and that continues to this day. And that due to all of the above, that there is an ever increasing range of guidance material and standards and guidelines that demonstrate what the integration of human factors principles looks like. So many of you in the audience have either developed the content or participated in the development or review of much of the guidance and standards that I've shown today. Sometimes as part of your job and sometimes in your spare time, all to make railways safer by optimising human wellbeing and overall system performance. And the research is critical to our success, particularly with the implementation of the research findings to support system design. Another part of the success is forums such as this, where we can openly discuss and brainstorm issues, and RISSB providing assistance for this HF Managers Group to put on this webinar today is another landmark. So what will success continue to look like into the future? Well, there's no doubt that the factors contributing to the past success will contribute to the future success. And you've told us during consultation sessions of the challenges and opportunities that need to be addressed for a bright future for human factors in rail. So while you've told us that there is a recognition of HFE in rail, you've also told us that there can be a really mixed understanding about what we do. Do we do design? Do we do incident investigation? Do we do HMI and cognitive HF versus do we do physical ergonomics? You also told us in rail that there's still quite a predominance of a blame culture with a limited just culture approach, and that there's still an emphasis on the safe widget rather than the system interfaces and a safe, efficient network. So there are considerable opportunities to continue to ensure all stakeholders know what we do and what we offer. And you've also told us, whilst there is a growing body of HFE professionals in rail, that there's actually a limited pool for rail-specific expertise. And the current university offerings are not producing rail-ready candidates, and there's a limited time to mentor and grow HF practitioners. So there really are opportunities to advocate for local HF courses that can facilitate industry-ready candidates. You also told us that collaboration and consultation has been a real success, and you can see that with what I've shown you this afternoon. And it really is at the core of our profession, and it's something everyone's keen to continue. You've told us about advocacy and the challenges about this being an ongoing process, and that we need to have the ability to influence procurement and major design decisions, and that human factors needs to be reinforced in contracts, and that we need to ensure that HF integration is not piecemeal, particularly with the larger projects, and we need to ensure that resources don't get tied up in assurance processes, because safety assurance is not a proxy for HF analysis. So there are opportunities to continue to advocate both within our organisations and externally. You've told us about research and guidance, that more guidance is required, for example, about fatigue risk management, particularly with the regulatory provision to monitor hours of work and impacts of changes on rail safety. And there is a RISSB development group on that that's currently in progress. You've told us that resources for in-house HF training would really be useful, and that there are obviously ongoing challenges associated with the ironies of automation, issues with human-machine interfaces, situational awareness, interoperability, and alarm management. So there are opportunities to create more content and to advertise and publicise what's already out there. And if you haven't looked at the RISSB site or the RISSB site from the UK and the new website called railhof.org, which you'll probably hear more about this afternoon, I highly recommend that you do. And obviously conferences, forums and webinars such as this one are great opportunities to share knowledge about what's worked and what hasn't. But maybe we should also target more conferences of non-HF groups and those that we wish to advocate to for another sort of dual purpose opportunity. So while there's more work to do, I hope that a brief reminder of the history and some of the work many of you have done to date can reinvigorate us all, because the future of human factors is really looking bright. And with that, I'd like to say thank you again and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for setting the scene for us and giving us a vision of the future, I hope. And I hope we here will have a part to play in that. Okay, so let's move into our main program with our technical presentations. This is the part where we're really keen for you to add some questions in the chat. If we have the opportunity at the end of each session, we'll throw a couple of those at our presenters. First up, our first presentation is not actually about rail, but it does emphasise the importance of learning from other industries. Melissa Bezari is Professor of Human Factors and leads the Digital Health Human Factors Group at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on evaluating and optimising health technologies to support healthcare, work and improve patient safety. Welcome back to the rail industry, Melissa, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and thanks very much for the invitation. I've got a bit of an imposter syndrome just listening to Alison's presentation there. But anyway, I hope you find my reflections useful. Hopefully you can see my slide as well. So today I'm going to give you a personal perspective on some of the challenges and opportunities with integrating human factors and ergonomics into healthcare. And so I'll give you a bit of a personal story and hopefully some lessons that are applicable to everyone. So as Fiona mentioned, I lead a small research group at the University of Sydney. We're the Digital Health Human Factors Research Group, and we apply human factors methods and approaches to evaluate and optimise health technologies to support healthcare work and patient safety. So most of the research I do is focused on digital health. We're embedded within a larger research theme at the University of Sydney, Biomedical Informatics and Digital Health we're called. And the larger group is focused on developing, applying, implementing and evaluating informatics tools to support human health. So my group's main research areas are really trying to understand and improve the fit between clinicians and the health technologies that they use in practice. And most of the work has focused on large clinical information systems, so things like electronic medication management systems, electronic prescribing, electronic medical records, with a focus on computerized decision support. I'm also very interested in the safety of health technology and the unintended consequences that we're seeing emerge with poorly designed health technologies or poorly implemented health technologies, and have been involved in quite a number of large-scale evaluations of the rollout of health technologies in practice. So we're a fairly small group. It's just me, a professor and a research fellow, 2 research assistants and I currently have 5 PhD students, but we do run about 10 projects at a time. So it's fairly busy, and about half of these are usually funded, and the rest of them are either projects we do in kind for our health service partners or PhD projects. We produce about 20 papers a year. All of our projects are partnership projects. I don't do any discovery, so all of my projects are working with health services to improve their systems. And we're We try and achieve good translation, so very quick to translate, a lot of redesign of technologies, findings to inform the selection or adoption of technologies, changes to policies and procedures, and trying to get our results incorporated into guidelines. It was very inspiring to see human factors in so many of the rail standards and guidelines. That's definitely not the case in healthcare, so we're really lagging behind in that way. Okay, so how I got here is I had an undergraduate in psychology. I did a PhD in psychology, but it was in habit formation in rats, so not really applied to human factors. But then I ventured into and completely changed track and went and did a postdoc in railway safety. So the focus of my postdoc was looking at train driver errors and the HFE contribution to these. And actually, thanks, Alison, for highlighting one of my presentations from many years ago. So I didn't really know what human factors was when I started my postdoc, and that actually speaks probably to one of Alison's points about training. But I was very lucky because I had Professor John Wilson as one of my mentors, and for the first 6 months of my postdoc, he basically handed me a big lot of HFE textbooks and said, "This is HFE, read these, we'll have chats about it," and that was kind of how I learned about HFE to start. So I did that for about 3 years, and then I needed to find another postdoc position, and a job came up in patient safety with a particular focus on how we could design electronic systems to minimize medication errors. And I knew nothing about healthcare, but went into the interview with all my HFE knowledge and told them, you know, I'm sure there are lots of things which would transfer across, and got the job. And I've been working in that space ever since. So I'm not a typical academic in that I didn't enter into a teaching research position like most academics do for quite a while. So I was a research-only academic for 13 years, just doing research. And then it just recently moved into a more traditional teaching research position. Interestingly, though, we don't have human factors education here at the University of Sydney, so I don't teach human factors. I teach digital health. Okay, so there are lots and lots of challenges with HFE integration in healthcare, and specifically in health technology, I think. These are just kind of a summary. There's definitely a misunderstanding of HFE as a discipline. I have to explain what it is at least on a weekly basis, usually more often than that. We don't really have any HFE people around. So when I was in the rail, doing the rail stuff, there seemed to be HF people that I was talking to all the time. When I moved across to do my postdoc in patient safety, I was actually based in a hospital, the basement of a hospital in the pharmacy department, and I sat there for 10 years and no one knew what human factors was. I didn't know any other human factors people that worked in health at the time. So it was really quite a lonely type of job. And then these other things I'm sure apply to all other industries, hard to quantify and value the cost of HFE. It's really hard to get grant funding for HFE in health and medicine, but I've tried to work around that. And then a big thing is also that the system design and redesign is really challenging, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So my first impressions of HFE in healthcare, as I said, I was based in a hospital in Sydney. My clinician at the time, my supervisor at the time was a clinician at the hospital. The hospital were leaders in implementation of electronic medication management systems. So they had removed the paper charts from the ends of the beds at hospitals and replaced it with an electronic system. And it was the first hospital in New South Wales to do this. And my supervisor, who was a clinical pharmacologist, was a real champion on moving away from paper to electronic systems. So the first challenge was there was really poor awareness and understanding of HFE. No one knew what it was. If they had heard of human factors, they assumed it was factors related to people, like decision-making errors, violations. Even the Patient Safety and Quality Committee at the hospital didn't really understand what HFE was. So what I did was run a lot of research projects at the hospital as part of my postdoc position. I tried to be really visible on the wards for data collection, tried to meet as many people as possible. I really tried to embed myself in the organisation, so I attended all the meetings, workshops, seminars. It was a very steep learning curve. I didn't really know anything about medicinal health or medication safety, which is where I landed when I started. And my supervisor was a very popular guy, and he was quite supportive. So he would just take me along to all these meetings and things, which helped. So over time, I really learned how to explain what HFE is simply to healthcare professionals. And soon people were coming to me with questions and problems that they needed HFE expertise on. So that was quite good because I was based there, and then people would come and say, oh, look, we've just implemented this new risk assessment tool. We're finding very poor uptake. Can we work with you to determine why that is and what changes we need to do? So this led to quite a lot of outputs. So my research projects mainly focused on computerized alerts. So these are the things that pop up to users as they're prescribing, decision support for antimicrobial prescribing, electronic information sources, dosing decision support. I evaluated the hospital's journey board, looked at risk assessment tools, looked at doctors' work practices after hours and on weekends, mobile app for gout management, so all sorts of different things while I was based there at the hospital. So I'll just quickly provide some examples. So here was a program of work which I'm continuing. This is really my main focus area of research on computerized alerts. This is an alert that triggers, this is an allergy alert. Might be not that clear, but it is an allergy alert. And it's telling the user that their patient has a potential allergy to ACE inhibitors. So what I did at the time was do a lot of work observations, looked at how doctors interacted with alerts and used the system, lots of interviews with the different end users, chart audits to determine how many alerts were being triggered per day, per patient, per user, and then ran surveys and Delphi studies to try and reach a consensus among the end users on which alerts should be removed from the system. So the key findings from this were that doctors were being over-alerted and experiencing alert fatigue. So they were getting hundreds of alerts. Alerts were typically ignored by the end users. But I also learned that alerts were used differently in different contexts by different users. So for example, during ward rounds, I found that no one would read the alerts or raise anything triggered in an alert with their team. But when I observed junior doctors working independently after hours, so say 6 p.m. when the senior doctor had gone home for the day, I saw that the junior doctors would read the alerts carefully to make sure that there were no errors in their orders because they were responsible at that time for order entry. I also uncovered that alert design was suboptimal. So from all of the methods I used, work observations were definitely the most useful. They revealed a lot about what was going on. And I often found that what people told me was inconsistent with what I observed. So people, I think, generally have a poor perception of how often these things are interfering with their work or how much time. So, for example, one of the most common complaints I get from people is that, using the electronic system is much more time consuming than using paper-based systems, but that is not always the case. So some time and motion studies we did where we timed people using systems and using paper found no difference, but it's just the perception people have of these systems. So here are some quotes from doctors. It pops up so often, which can be a very bad thing because you're dismissing it so often that you develop this sort of mechanism. So it can be bad in a sense that sometimes you might miss some important things. Wrong time, the decision to prescribe something is based on your clinical knowledge. By the time you type it in and prescribe, you've already made that decision. Poor design. I guess less words and more point form would be easier because then you wouldn't have to scroll through paragraphs and sentences of text. So what changed as a result of this research? Well, many alerts were removed from the electronic system. So over half of the alert burden, I was able to reduce alert burden by half. But there were limited changes possible to the actual alert design because this is controlled by the vendor. All the locally developed alerts were redesigned, but there are limitations on what could be done. I also gave lots of presentations and at conferences and forums and things about the bad design that these people that the users have to deal with. And now my good alert design principles are used by lots of hospitals and districts in Australia, and they appear in our New South Wales Health Clinical Decision Support Guideline. So over time, though, I did notice that outside of the hospital, HFE was getting a bit more attention. So in our New South Wales health pillars, like the Clinical Excellence Commission and eHealth New South Wales, they were starting to recruit HFE professionals, and this was quite exciting. So I saw this as an opportunity to establish partnerships with these organisations. So I'll just give an example of a partnership with eHealth New South Wales. So eHealth New South Wales are our digital health centre for excellence, and they plan, support and implement the information technologies across our hospitals. So how this partnership came about was I approached eHealth New South Wales with an idea for a partnership grant, and we entered into this together, and this is just wrapping up this year. So I mentioned in my earlier slide about the challenges with getting funding to do HFE research. So the way I do this is I combine the HFE elements with large-scale evaluations of health technologies, because we really don't have many of these occurring. So people are rolling out health technologies based on the potential that they're going to achieve benefits in patient safety or quality or efficiency, but we don't have many trials to show this. So the way to get funding is to say that you're going to run these large-scale evaluations to show that the implementation of this technology will improve safety, for example, and then along the side, I can do some of the more interesting HFE work to understand how the systems are actually functioning in practice. So this is an ongoing partnership. So I approach eHealth New South Wales with all my new partnership projects and submit expressions of interest for all their requests for work. So I do quite a lot of HFE evaluations for all of their new systems and things before they roll them out. I give my time in kind for some things, and they do the same for me. And I've worked really hard with them on developing a reputation as someone that they can approach if they need HFE expertise, which is good. So the research projects with eHealth New South Wales have focused on similar things, so computerised alerts, electronic medication management in paediatrics, oncology, reducing polypharmacy, systems to support the transfer of patients between ICUs and hospital wards, and then also a couple of PhD projects where staff who work at eHealth New South Wales are now completing PhDs, which is really exciting to see. So a quick example is design and implementation of a computerised decision support tool to support de-prescribing. And this project was led by Professor Sarah Hilmer, who's a geriatrician here at the University of Sydney, and her research is focused on getting people to de-prescribe, so remove medications, not keep adding more and more medications to a patient's medication list. And so I was engaged by Sarah to lead the design of a tool in the electronic medical record to support this process. So we did work observations and lots of interviews and co-design workshops and then usability testing. And we landed on this. So it's not the most pretty design, again, because this is very dependent on the system and how all of the colors and everything's kind of dictated by that. But this is a patient's risk of polypharmacy, and these are the medications. And if you want to remove this medication, you would go modify and then remove that medication. So you can see over a patient's admission, their risk of experiencing an adverse event from being on too many medications might go up and down. And you can see this over the patient journey. So this tool was embedded in the electronic medical record of 2 local health districts in New South Wales. And our pilot results showed that it resulted in a change. So we saw more patients getting medications de-prescribed when the tool was in use. And so we're now testing the tool across a much larger number of hospitals in a large controlled trial so that we can show that it is effective. And then we have eHealth New South Wales on board for a state statewide rollout of the tool. So the biggest challenge here is that technology changes, design and redesign is really difficult. We have very limited redesign possible at the local level. Our electronic medical record systems are not Australian, they're US, they're off-the-shelf products. We can't make changes to many of the features and functions in the systems. And in fact, even when we determine that there might be a safety issue, so we've had many incidents where a patient has been harmed or potentially even died, and the system design has contributed to this, we still can't get the system changes made. So it's an ongoing challenge with us with the design of our large-scale systems. Okay, the next partnership I thought I'd talk about is with the district, so Sydney Local Health District, which is just next door actually to the university here, and it includes 6 hospitals and lots of community care and also a virtual hospital which emerged during COVID-19. So how this partnership came about is I approached Sydney Local Health District about partnering on research, and they also approached me, and so we're doing a lot of partnering on lots and lots of different projects. We meet regularly to discuss projects and needs. We submit lots of grant applications together, not many successful, but we try. I give my time in kind for them, and they do the same for me. In the same way, if they have any kind of HFE issues, then they contact me to try and help them sort them out. So these research projects have focused on decision support in virtual care, remote monitoring devices in virtual care. They use a hands-free communication system at this hospital, nursing documentation in the electronic medical record. I'm doing a large project at the moment on their new patient booking and navigation system. And then again, a couple of PhD projects with people from the district. So I'll just provide a quick example here. So this project was initiated because they realized their nurses were experiencing a lot of documentation burden in their electronic medical record, and they wanted to remove the unnecessary data entry fields. So the main goal here was to identify the data elements that could be removed or moved from the nursing admission form. So when a patient comes in, the nursing staff are required to complete an admission form, which had hundreds of data entry points that the nurses needed to pop in. So what we did is review the data. So we looked at which fields were being completed, when they were being completed, by who. We also did a review of practice. So we looked at the workflows, talked to the nurses about what they were doing, what tools they were using, how useful the nursing admission form was. We reviewed policies to determine if there was anything in the policies that actually needed to be collected at the point of time at admission. And then we ran some workshops to reach a consensus on what elements could be removed from the data from the admission form. So what we found very briefly is that we found 32% were never completed of the data entry bits in the form. So that's a third of the form was never, ever completed. And we found some which were always completed, but these were mandatory fields. So not so surprising. And then 43% variably completed. When we spoke to nurses, they said it's something they just have to do more than something that they value. It was really considered, the form was really considered a bit of a tick box exercise. So overall, after we completed all these steps, we actually found that only 9% of the data elements should be maintained in the admission form. So that's a lot of elements that the nurses are being forced to complete on admission, and they don't really need to be doing it. 57% could be removed due to low utilisation or duplication of other sections in the electronic medical record, and 27% could be moved and collected through existing sections of the EMR. So this project really highlighted that systems should be designed with the objective in mind. The main objective of the admission form is care planning, so all of the data elements that are not needed for care planning should really be removed from the nursing admission form. And unnecessary documentation is a really big problem with our electronic systems in healthcare. It leads to the users becoming really frustrated. They start to really hate the EMR because it's just so time consuming. And it also leads to quite a lot of workarounds. In fact, I've never, in the 15 years I've been working in healthcare, I've never seen a system used the way it was intended to be used. So workarounds are a really big issue with health technology, and completely understandable if we look at the way the systems are designed. So what changed as a result of the research? The hospital moved to a new it's going to move to a new electronic medical record. So I'm not sure how many of you know this, but New South Wales Health is dumping its current electronic medical record, and all of our hospitals will move to the same electronic medical record in the next few years. So they don't want to make too many changes to the current electronic medical record, but people are still asking for things to be added to the admission form all the time, and so they just bring the paper up and go, actually, we shouldn't really add anything because we've got too much already in the data collection form. Okay, so I know that was a very quick rundown, but I thought I'd just end with my reflections on the value of breaking down the barriers between human factors and ergonomics in medicine and health, because I find this quite challenging over the years, but I'm not giving up. I'm definitely not going to jump ship yet. So I think HFE allows you to really uncover issues that may not be known to the executives and decision makers within healthcare organisations. And the same for issues that might not be known to end users. So I mentioned the discrepancy between what I've observed in practice and also what I get from doing qualitative work. And sometimes this doesn't actually connect up. So work observation I find is the most, in practice I find is the most useful method, and especially when you feed your findings back to the end users. HFE allows you to generate evidence that is robust and scientific. It's also definitely increased awareness. These kinds of partnerships increase awareness of HFE in healthcare, what it is, what value it adds. And HFE is really interdisciplinary in itself, so it can provide us with opportunities to apply learnings across domains, for example, from transport to health. And this is particularly important for health, I think, which is really lagging behind other disciplines in its adoption of HFE. And then HFE advocacy is, I think, really important. So Alison touched on this as well, but I do as much as I can in all the spare time I have. So with the International Ergonomics Association, with our national society, I'm the society's representative for WHO, and then I try to really get involved in the medical informatics communities. The people who work in the tech space really need to be aware of the HFE parts, and so I try and represent HFE on our working groups and things in those communities. And that's it from me. I'll just say thanks to everyone in my team and all my collaborators on the projects that I present today. And I'm very happy to take any questions and also to share any papers if people have an interest.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was fantastic. If anyone has any questions, please jump in the Q&A section and add them in there. We've got a couple in there already that I'm going to throw at you. From Kim, how long did it take for HFE to become more understood and visible and for people to start coming to you? What was that sort of period like from that first day in the basement of that hospital to people actively engaging? I know you talked us through a lot of the work that you did in terms of being visible and going to certain people. What was that sort of time period like?
I think it was probably about 5 years. I didn't see anything for the first couple of years, that's for sure. But it was also because I was learning about healthcare and learning about the processes and the organisation. So I think it was a two-way kind of learning experience. So I think after 5 years or so was when especially people stopped going to my supervisor, who was the consultant, and started to come to me. So my consultant wasn't a HFE professional, but I explained as soon as I started what HFE was. And so he'd walk around with me and he'd go, oh, Mel, she's a HFE professional. You know, you might need HFE people in what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. And so then that really helped. And then people started to come to me after a few years. So it was not a quick process, but definitely worth the effort, I think.
A lot of people picked up on that sort of most recent project that you shared around that sort of system simplification and taking out all the unnecessary data points. And you talked about the state now updating that whole system. Has that piece of work enabled you potentially to set up some requirements for the development of the new system that's coming in?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm going to just be delicate in my response.
Yeah.
So I think there are limitations on what can be achieved with the new system. So there are off-the-shelf systems that you can configure at, and for us, will be at the state level. So there are limitations on what can be done. I think the state, like our eHealth New South Wales, really recognised the value of HFE, and when they were procuring, so they had a lot of presentations from many different electronic medical record vendors, and they made sure that there was at least one HFE person in the room during those presentations to give their feedback on usability or acceptability or whatever it was that they were, were going to give comments on during. I don't think that's enough, but they did try. At least they recognise the importance of the discipline in that selection process. And they also plan to have very large design working groups when it comes to designing different parts of the electronic medical record. And I assume that there will be some HFE input. Definitely their design working groups are very focused on the end users. So they do have a lot of clinicians in the room giving their feedback about, different parts of the system. But I'm hoping they'll also call on HFE expertise for that.
Yes, one would hope so. I guess a similar question was a lot of the work that you're doing relating to systems and tech. Were you always able to get involved from the outset, or did you tend to be involved much further along? Has that changed at all since the beginning, or are you still kind of coming in once the system is designed or the requirements or the spec is set?
Yeah, so at the start, I would say 100% was all redesign. So going in post-implementation, because people were having problems, they were having either new safety issues emerge, or a lot of negative feedback from end users, or people noticed the systems were being worked around. So some of these are obviously mandatory, like electronic medical records, but then the features within them are all optional, right? So there's a lot of work gone into designing decision support embedded in these systems, and they just found people were not using them, hundreds of dashboards and all these things that they've worked on and spent millions of dollars in designing, and people who just don't use them. And so then they would say, oh, Mel, can you come in, have a look, see what's going on? So most of it would be post-implementation where people realise. I think over time, I've done a little bit more of the initial design. So there has probably been a bit of a shift, but I would say it's still 95%, 5%. And that, I think a lot of that speaks to the types of technologies that I focused on. So I think if I was doing more things on like apps for patients and things like that, it would be much more of the design work. But because my research focus is much more on these large information systems, they just bought, and then all of it happens post.
We're getting to time now, but is there one takeaway that you would give to us in the rail industry from your experience in terms of something that we should really, one thing we could do to really try and improve the effectiveness of us as HF people, or to raise the profile of human factors? Something we can learn in rail.
Yeah, I think I should be learning from you guys, not the other way around. I mean, just hearing Alison's presentation and seeing how much HFE integration there is in healthcare, that's really, really exciting. I think probably something we need to have a bit more cross-discipline kind of meetings and things, because I think the health industry would be really keen to learn from some of the success stories from rail, definitely. We're really, really far behind.
Well, hopefully there'll be some interesting things to pick up with some of the rest of our presenters today for you. But thank you so much for giving us your time and for sharing your experience with us today. Thank you, Melissa.
My pleasure.
Okay, on to our second presentation, which comes from two of the key drivers behind the industry's fatigue risk management collaboration group. Elena Belcher is from RISSB and joined Rail in 2021, having previously spent 20 years in various roles across operations, safety and human factors within the aviation industry. She has a particular passion for fatigue risk management, non-technical skills and threat and error management. Part of a multidisciplinary safety team, her role includes leading human factors initiatives and reviewing and enhancing fatigue risk management. Nathan Hines has been working in the transport and rail industry for over 18 years. As part of the HF team at Transport for New South Wales, he collaborates with operational and project teams to ensure systems are designed to be safely and effectively used by all end users. He provides human factors integration support for engineering and business requirements wherever safety and success depend on safe and effective human performance. Over to you, Elena and Nathan.
Thanks so much, Fiona. And can I just get a quick check to make sure that we are on the screen and it's presenting well?
You are on the screen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Fiona. And good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the Rail Industry Collaboration in Fatigue Risk Management presentation. Before we jump into the presentation, we would just like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the support of all the Fatigue Risk Management Collaboration Group members who may be present online today. We are very fortunate to have representatives in the group from rail industry organisations represented on this slide, and the insights that we are able to share today is based upon the efforts and success of this collaboration group. We hope at the end of this presentation you'll gain an insight into the importance of ensuring that human factors integration plays a significant role in fatigue risk management, and hopefully Elena and I will be able to keep you all engaged and effectively manage everyone's fatigue risk as we move into the post-lunch dip period. During the presentation, we'll be briefly discussing the following topics, and as much as we'd love to be able to present for the entire afternoon on our favourite subject, we have put together the best bang for buck in the 25 minutes that we have with you today. I'd now like to hand over to Elena to discuss the importance of fatigue risk management.
Thanks, Nathan. We thought we'd kick off with trying to understand, well, why is fatigue risk so important, and why do we have a group of passionate individuals that meet frequently and talk for hours and hours on fatigue? Well, let's look at some of the impairments that might be associated with someone who is fatigued. So when we think about fatigue and fatigue impairment, we may see slower cognitive processing, increasing sleepiness, memory deficits, decreases in attention, negative effects in decision making, increasing errors, of course, microsleeps, distractions, and a loss of situational awareness. When we look at some of these things and some of the things that may be caused from fatigue and consider that in the context of our wider system and rail system, we can clearly see how fatigue and managing the risk of fatigue is so important to safety of rail. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Elena. I'd now like to give you insight into the Fatigue Risk Management Collaboration Group. The Fatigue Risk Management Collaboration Group was formed in 2020, where it was recognised within the human factors community that there was an opportunity to bring together a group of rail transport operator representatives and provide a forum where there could be collaborative discussions on all things directly related to fatigue risk management. Membership of the group was extended directly to specific roles that were responsible for the design and integration of a rail transport operator's organisational fatigue risk management program. The current membership sits at 14 rail transport operator representatives, and we have representatives from all modes of rail, being passenger, freight, light rail, and also from rail infrastructure maintainer. The group members are based all around Australia and extending out to New Zealand, which provides an amazing diversity of representatives. The primary purpose of this group is to enable a forum where we can collaborate and support one another, discuss challenges, and provide opportunities to learn and share from each other. In the next slides, we'll provide more detail on this. Lastly, the group has been fortunate to be able to partner with the Rail Industry Standards and Safety Board in 2022 that has enabled the group to reach out to additional RTOs and provide a collaborative platform where the group can provide feedback and support to the rail industry in matters relating to fatigue risk management. Over to you, Elena.
Thanks, Nathan. As Nathan mentioned, one of the key purposes of the Fatigue Risk Management Collaboration Group is clearly collaboration and sharing of learnings amongst rail operators. So members come to these meetings and they're able to provide insights on fatigue risk management processes, designer processes, and what things they are doing to improve their organisation's fatigue risk management system. We share solutions and approaches to common challenges, enabling learning across industry, and also the different approaches that different organisations are taking, and we can take those away and consider how they may be applicable to our own organisations. We are trying to improve human factors integration through engaging human factors specialists in the support of fatigue risk management design and improvement. And we're also heavily invested in organisational approaches or organisational psychology approaches to change and human-centred design change around fatigue. We have ongoing discussions on research and developments in fatigue, science and shift work, not only in rail, but across other safety critical and high reliability industries. We have an ongoing agenda item to discuss and review fatigue technology, and we're really focused on the scientific validation of that tech. And we also extend an invite to external speakers and experts on fatigue, and it's a very great development opportunity for members who might be new to fatigue and human factors. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Helena. So we'll now share some insights into the common challenges that organisations, not only across the rail industry, but in every industry, are facing in respect to fatigue risk. These challenges are not exhaustive, but are representative of the common challenges that the collaboration group discusses on a regular basis. In respect of workforce, we know that there is a direct correlation of fatigue risk exposure linked between operational requirements and workforce availability. Across the rail industry, we are experiencing a shortage of being able to attract and retain workers to the industry, especially in our operational frontline roles. Where an organisation is experiencing a shortage in workforce availability, this puts upwards pressure to utilise existing levels of workforce, and this further constrains the workforce in being able to access leave to rest and recover. We are starting to see the emerging impacts in psychosocial workplace hazards that can be linked to a shortage in workforce availability. These emerging impacts has led to Safe Work New South Wales recently releasing a code of practice to increase the awareness and education on managing this hazard. Lastly, we are aware of the challenges with organisational cultural attitudes towards fatigue that has a direct impact on the worker themselves feeling confident and comfortable with raising their hands and saying the F word, being fatigue. Education about understanding what fatigue is and how it directly impacts a worker's performance is critical in addressing this challenge. Workers' ability to identify within themselves that they may be experiencing physical or cognitive signs of fatigue impairment is a critical control in trying to prevent a fatigue-related accident or injury occurrence. In respect of fatigue risk management tools, we are observing a number of constraints around ensuring that the functionality of fatigue risk management support tools is aligned to the organisation's fatigue risk management program. In particular, operational monitoring systems may have limited or inadequate functionalities in respect of identifying the multitude of fatigue risk factors and integrating a practicable mitigation process for all involved. In addition to this, there are still observations where an organisation has integrated a fatigue biomathematical tool. The understanding of the tool design principles and the limitations of the tool is varied across an organisation. And combined, where there are gaps in operational monitoring functionalities, we observe a challenge in overcoming an over-reliance of biomathematical tools, especially influencing operational decisions around fatigue risk. When it comes to designing fatigue risk management tools, the biggest challenges organisations face is being able to design tools that support organisations being able to shift away from prescriptive-based processes and integrating a more risk-based risk-based approach. In a 24/7 operational environment, there is no one-size-fits-all approach, with so many work groups and workers having to undertake so many different tasks and can be exposed to so many different fatigue risks. This is why it is so critical to ensure that whenever designing fatigue risk management tools, that human factors and/or fatigue specialists are involved. And Elena is going to speak more into the challenges around this.
Thanks, Nathan. And just covering off the third and final challenge that we see consistently across organisations within this group. And this is a HF forum, so it would be remiss of us not to say HF and fatigue specialists are really important, and they actually are required when you're thinking about fatigue. Fatigue is not a simple topic. It is complex, and due to the scale of fatigue risk management programs and some of the challenges that Nathan has previously talked about, we are seeing specialists coming in to undertake what is very much multi-year projects, and there is no quick fix to the management of fatigue. We are seeing a shortage of human factors specialists across the industry, seeing those impacts where HFI is not considered adequately within an organisation and within an organisation's fatigue risk management program. Limited SMEs are available to support systems and equipment design. And that impacts our continuous improvement approaches to fatigue and the maintenance of contemporary knowledge and fatigue science. Lack of fatigue risk analysis being integrated into system and equipment design, also into organisational fatigue management system designs, and difficulty in establishing quantifiable data on fatigue and fatigue risk exposure due to the complexity of the topic. If we don't have fatigue and human factors specialists able to support an organisation with some of these things, we may find that data is lacking and it's difficult without HF analysis built into organisational processes for the organisation to really understand and target where those risks might be. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Elena. So through the collaboration group, we're getting insight into organisational approaches that rail transport operators are exploring in trying to continually improve fatigue risk management programs. And the benefit of this collaboration group is that where we are discussing them as a group, we're able to take learnings from these approaches and potentially bring them back within each of our own organisations respectively. Some of the organisation approaches that are being explored include a focus on re-establishing updated organisational education and training, incorporating advancements in scientific research on fatigue risk, and creating greater awareness around the implications of fatigue risk exposure to help support the change process and positive engagement with all involved, wherever organisations are exploring process changes and integration of fatigue risk management tools. We're also seeing approaches where organisations are completing evaluations of existing workforce monitoring systems and looking at ways to further enhance the systems to provide greater insight into fatigue risk exposure and align with the prescribed processes of an organisation's fatigue risk management program. We're also seeing approaches where organisations are reviewing fatigue risk assessment processes and tools to try and design a more robust risk assessment process that has greater detail in being able to take into consideration the direct risk factors that workers and work groups are exposed to whenever performing tasks or operating equipment in a rail operation environment. Over to you, Elena.
Thanks, Nathan. And moving on from what Nathan has just talked about in terms of robust and specific fatigue risk assessment processes, organisations are all trying to move away or moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach into a risk-based approach in managing fatigue. So we can't have a single set of hours, a single biomathematical model used across all work groups to cover all tasks. We're really moving towards a risk-based approach where we're trying to consider those things and that are part of the job that may contribute to fatigue. We're taking that human-centred design approach to designing organisations' fatigue risk management programs and trying to enable the practical application of integrating a risk-based approach into fatigue, because as we said, we can't always have fatigue and human factors specialists on hand out in all these organisations to help us understand fatigue risk. Project plans, and they are big plans that the group are sharing with us, include significant mapping of change impacts with integration and fatigue risk into operational processes. What we understand with fatigue and what the group is saying is it's not just fatigue by itself. Fatigue affects everything from people, processes, and systems within the organisation.
So, as you can see, the collaboration group is doing an extensive amount of work with the limited time that we have together. The group meets every 2 months. We've only got a 2-hour window that we meet, and so there's a lot of work that we as group members we really want to discuss with each other and demonstrate and give insights into how we're approaching. So hopefully we've given you just a snapshot of what the collaboration group has been doing since it was established in 2020, and hopefully as we progress we are able to collaboratively work together on some more specific research that will begin through these types of forums. We'll be able to give greater insight into how rail operations are progressing in terms of improving fatigue risk management. So in summary, we know that fatigue is a complex topic and requires specialist knowledge. So we really want to make sure that within an organisation that human factors specialists and or fatigue specialists are always actively involved. And it doesn't need to be just in a fatigue risk management program sense. Through the human factors integration process, we as human factors specialists take into consideration everything to do with the design interface, but we're also looking at the physical and cognitive limitations that fatigue risk can have an impairment of, and ensuring that the design of a system, a task, or a piece of equipment has that consideration in the design. So we're not just relying upon the fatigue risk management program, but we actually are integrating fatigue risk management mitigation within the design itself. We know that it requires across the organisation that human factors integration is integrated into all phases of change, and that is in respect of whenever we're designing or enhancing a fatigue risk management program, we need to make sure that the HFI process is also integrated into that process design. We want to make sure that we culturally try to improve and have a significant shift away from a prescriptive rule-based approach. The prescriptive rule-based approach does not give an adequate coverage in terms of managing fatigue risk due to the complexity and all of the fatigue risk exposures that workers and the workforce are exposed to. Over to you, Elena.
Thanks, Nathan. And what we know, continuing on from what Nathan has just mentioned, an organisation's fatigue risk management program must consider and accommodate work groups with their specific and unique fatigue risks. Fatigue is not the same for everyone, and it's much more than just about whether you work night shift or day shift. There's a whole raft of factors that the organisation needs to consider within a work group's actual work and task that come into fatigue and our exposure to fatigue risk. So again, in summary, this group is supporting industry-wide enhancements in safety through a successful submission to RISSB for a guideline that's specific to monitoring of hours of work and fatigue risk. And the group really provides a forum for fatigue specialists, either experienced or new and emerging, to leverage off collaboration, support each other, learn from each other, and really learn about fatigue risk, design, initiatives, and approaches across industry.
Thanks, Elena. So for anyone online today who would like to find out more information on the Fatigue Risk Management Collaboration Group, you can visit the RISSB Fatigue Risk Management Collaboration Group website page through the details on the screen, or feel free to reach out to myself through my email contact. So thank you to everyone for joining online today. And I'd just like to personally thank Elena for being an awesome co-host with me today. I'll hand back over to Fiona for questions.
Thank you very much to both of you. That was really interesting. If anyone has any questions, please pop them in the Q&A up the top. I've got a couple for you. So one, as it loads for me, one was particularly around how we balance the issue of EAs and fatigue requirements. It's obviously an industry challenge. How do people within their organisations keep fatigue on the table through those conversations? Have you seen that done successfully, and what are some of the challenges there?
Elena, do you want me to start, or do you want to start, or?
Yeah, you can go, Nathan.
So I think it's a really great question. And obviously, we need to recognise that each mechanism has its own design. So we want to make sure that we collaborate. It's all about collaborating and ensuring that as early as possible, you bring all parties involved. So that's the workforce, management, union representatives, health and safety representatives, all to the table, because effectively everyone has the same goal. We want to make sure workers come to work safe and go home safe. And so it's through that collaborative and consultation forums that these types of issues need to be brought to the table, so that collaboratively, I think through the design of a fatigue risk management program, that these types of issues can be worked through in that collaborative forum, and making sure that they're not impacting on each of those mechanisms respectfully.
And if I would just add to that, I'd also say around collaboration and consultation. Our workers and the people that do the work out there in the rail industry are the absolute experts on fatigue. So whilst we can read all the books and we can work really hard, listening to people and listening to the people who are out there working in industry is a critical consideration when it comes to fatigue, because they know their work better than anyone else.
Response. A question from Martin just come in now. What have we learned from the airline industry in regards to fatigue management and risk that we're applying to rail? Obviously, aviation is looked at fatigue for perhaps a more significant period of time. I'd assume there's some parallels. What has the group and you guys collectively taken and applied in that rail context?
Elena, I think you're definitely the expert to be able to provide this response.
Yeah, certainly. As part of a fatigue risk management process, we do look at what other industries are doing and what we can learn from them. Where aviation is a little bit different to rail in that they've had a risk-based approach and a requirement for risk-based approach for many, many years, at least more than 20 years that I was in the industry. But what we need to understand is rail is unique. While there are similarities, aviation has additional considerations and additional things that may contribute to fatigue risk. But what we can learn from the aviation industry is how their fatigue risk management systems are structured, and the things they do to set up their SMS, to utilise data to inform decisions, reporting requirements, and also where there might be gaps in scientific knowledge within rail, and maybe that research hasn't happened yet, we can look to aviation and consider how some of the extensive research that has been done in that industry might actually be applicable to us in rail.
Thank you. Another question from Tara, which is around how we get organisations to take more responsibility for managing the fatigue of their workforce, rather than the tendency to blame the individual for being tired, for it to be personal reasons, for whatever. How do we make organisations take responsibility for that system level control over fatigue risk, I guess?
It's a great question, and thanks, Tara, for providing it. It's a challenge, and we've been, as a group, it's something we always talk about, and it's really about education. So educating from the top, starting at the top and all the way down, and then breaking down those responsibilities. So just creating that awareness that it's not okay to just say, well, it's too hard, so we don't have to do anything about it. It's about raising the awareness that we need to be able to demonstrate through the organisation the so far as reasonably practicable argument that we've done everything hand on heart, we've done everything we can from a systems design perspective, that we are practically able to identify fatigue, assess it, put controls in place to make sure that we are supporting the worker and the workforce being able to perform their tasks while not introducing unnecessary fatigue risk exposure. So it is about that education and getting commitment as well. I mean, a lot of organisations, they put out the policies that they are committed to this. So it's about just reinforcing that from the top level down. That's what a lot of organisations are trying to do that approach.
And we start with understanding that fatigue risk is a dual responsibility. There is a responsibility for the organisation to, as Nathan points out, manage fatigue risks so far as reasonably practical. And then there's a responsibility for the individuals to manage themselves and their time away from work to ensure that they're appropriately rested and ready to come to work. So fatigue very much is a dual model. And as Nathan pointed to, and I think it was number 1 in one of our slides, education and awareness is fundamental when it comes to fatigue risk.
Yep, thank you for that. One late one through from Peter, particularly around the risks of the increased use of contractors and the potential for casualisation of the workforce, having people that potentially are working for a number of different companies and accruing a lot more hours. How is the industry tackling that, or is there any work being done in this space through your experience in your organisations? Are you looking at this? Can you talk a little bit to that one?
Yeah, I believe there is, and this is through the various rail industry mechanisms, through industry collaborations. But I think it all comes back down to it is a complex issue, because contractor companies don't just contract to one single rail transport operator. They can contract to multitude of or multiple rail transport operators. So I think what the industry is trying to do and recognizes is that there's a gap in visibility of the data around the contract workforce. So one contract worker can turn up to one work site and it's really siloed in the data, is only siloed in that rail transport operator. And then when they're finished, they can move to another work site, which might be under another rail transport operator. So I think there is approaches to try and bring visibility in the data through things like the rail industry worker card. But again, I think it also comes back to that dual responsibility of the organisation to ensure that through safety and procurement, in that initial procurement with the contracting company, you know, there's assessments and audits done on how the integration of not only the contracting company's fatigue risk management system, how that aligns to the organisation's fatigue risk management system. And it comes back again to having adequate tools within the rail transport operator to, you know, integrate data from their rostering, so get visibility up front before that contractor worker turns up, ensuring that there is an alignment to the application of rostering principles. It all lines up, that work has been given adequate rest and recovery. So yeah, it's not an easy task. It's very complex, but that's where the industry is going in that respect.
Thank you. We've got one more couple of minutes, but seeing you mentioned that you're both working on the new development group around monitoring hours of work, do you want to just do a little quick brief on what brought that about? Because obviously it came from the development group as a topic that was definitely in need of a piece of work. Do you want to talk a little bit to what it's tackling and what the end goal hopefully is for that project?
Yeah, absolutely. Diana, do you want to start?
No, Nathan, I'll let you talk to that. And the wonderful Deb, I've seen a comment pop up, and Deb's online. She's not with us in rail anymore, but thanks to you, Deb, as well. Go.
Yeah, so really we recognise the amazing work. So if we look back, and Alison already provided some of the insights into, from a regulator's perspective, what is occurring. And I think what we recognised is there was some amazing work in trying to provide greater awareness and education, especially around the formation of the National Rail Safety National Law and the very prescriptive requirements in that national regulation and law. And me personally, I think it is the most difficult one to be able, as an organisation, to ensure that the fatigue risk management program is meeting those requirements, because we are dealing with such a complex issue. And so what we recognised and through the collaboration group, we could see that it wasn't just one organization. You know, you would think to yourself, is it just me? Is it just this organization that's struggling with the ability, especially around the monitoring? So the monitoring in an operational 24/7 environment is so complex. As we said in our presentation, from a planning perspective, you can really make sure from all the known factors at a particular point leading up to the day of operations, you can have everything covered. Then say 2 or 3 days out, all of a sudden the entire network goes into a degraded mode and your plan is literally gone out the window. So it's about, and that's where we recognize that we have gaps across not only individual organizations but across industry, is about having monitoring systems that provide that functionality and the insight into understanding whenever we make those significant network changes to manage day of operations, having the ability to overlay those fatigue risk management legislative requirements around being able to understand what has changed, being able to understand the potential increases in risk exposure, and then being able to mitigate them in an operational environment. And so through the ongoing discussions, that's why when the opportunity came up through RISSB to put the product proposal forward, we just Deb, as Elena said, we all just jumped on it and put that proposal together. So that's what that proposal is to try and provide guidance back to industry on how to, whether it's reviewing and evaluating an existing monitoring system, or if an organization is just about to engage in designing a monitoring system, the guideline will hopefully help support the organization understand what the functionalities should be included in that design to help enhance that monitoring.
It's a really dynamic operating environment, and if I can just sum up everything that Nathan just said, we're pretty good at planning, but that the dynamic changes when things go wrong, when things don't go as expected, that's where the organisations within the group sometimes see challenges, and that's where the benefit of this particular guideline could come into play. Is how do we meet those challenges? How do we monitor hours of work, and how do we manage that fatigue risk when everything is going pear-shaped?
Thank you very much, and thank you both for presenting today. That was excellent. There was lots of engagement in the chat on that one as well.
Thanks,
okay, we're going to take a short 10-minute break now, or maybe just slightly less. So you all have an opportunity to go and have a stretch and a cup of tea. We'll be starting back at 2:35 sharp, so please jump back on just a minute or two before so you don't miss anything. During the intermission, we're going to see some information just on where you can go for more information on rail human factors, on investigations, which is coming up towards the back end of our forum today. If you want to take a screenshot, you can follow up at your leisure later on, but it just gives people some information if they want to go and have a look. Very high level stuff. It's kind of a starting point for you, but hopefully there's some interesting internet wormholes to go down there for you. We'll see you back here at 2:35. Okay. It's 2:35, so welcome back and let's get moving on our presentations. So our next two presentations provide some great examples of the use of human factors methods to inform and evaluate design, particularly with a technology and innovations focus. Our first presentation in this section is another double up. We've got Anthony Whitmore and Bryony Outridge from the Queensland Rail Human Factors team. Anthony is the Human Factors Integration Manager within Safety, Risk and Assurance at QR. He's a Human Factors Specialist with over 10 years of experience in the application of Human Factors principles, tools and methods in the transport sector. Anthony's HF team informs projects and initiatives, including rolling stock overhauls, incident analysis, and the introduction of new technologies to help improve safety and performance. And Bryony is the Principal Human Factors Advisor within major projects for Queensland Rail. She's a registered psychologist with experience in managing behavioural and human factors projects within safety critical environments in the rail, emergency services, mining and transport industries. Welcome, Anthony and Bryony, over to you.
Good afternoon. Just checking that you can hear me.
Can you hear us okay?
Yep. We're going through one speaker, so we'll just check. So I'm just going to run you through a bit of an agenda and start the presentation for today. So we're just going to give a bit of an overview of the Cross River Rail project, which is the space that I mainly work in. So just to differentiate Anthony and I within the business a little bit, Anthony's team is internal facing projects and everything BAU, and I am Cross River Rail and external facing projects. So we're going to go through a bit of human performance and in particular technology, human-centred design and technology, and then do a little bit of a deep dive into the in-cab signalling project at Queensland Rail with the introduction of ETCS. So for those of you who are not aware about Cross River Rail project in Brisbane, Cross River Rail is going to expand our current network with a second river crossing, new rail line, 4 new underground stations and automated train protection through the implementation of the European Control System, or ETCS. Our focus today will be to look at human factors considerations for QR's adoption of ETCS Level 2 or in-cab signalling. ETCS is an automatic train protection system that monitors the position, direction and speed of the train, providing drivers with in-cab information and automatically applying brakes if required to avoid collision and other safety consequences. While ultimately the goal of ETCS technology is to improve both safety and capacity on our network, for Queensland Rail, this new technology will be implemented alongside existing legacy systems. So this means that parts of the network will have ETCS in-cab signalling, while other areas are going to retain existing line-side signals. ETCS equipment is also being retrofitted into existing QR fleet, which introduces challenges around how best to design to optimise the human system performance and safety. For drivers in particular, human-centred design is essential for ergonomic considerations, interface design and the interaction with the interface, identifying training needs specific to automation and to address any potential for human error associated with driving under 2 different signalling systems.
So I guess new technology introduces a number of interesting human factors considerations. So one of the changes that ETCS brings is an increased level of automation as the system is designed to intervene automatically if required, as Brian just mentioned. So an important aspect to recognise here is that the system doesn't replace the human operator, but it just changes the nature of some of the interactions. And sometimes that can be in ways that might be unintended or unanticipated by designers. So this makes it really important that we design these technologies in ways that helps the operator maintain their awareness and understanding of the system and the operational context. And without focused effort in the design and support of the ETCS system, operators can lose their awareness or understanding of what the system is doing and why. So for example, maybe what signalling system they're currently driving in and what might be needed in degraded or emergency situations. So it's really important to recognise as well that new systems don't always reduce task difficulty or things like workload. particularly in situations of ambiguity. And this can be due to things like the operator being out of the loop or having to switch between different train cabs that could have different control layouts and that kind of thing. So all of this, I guess, sort of demonstrates the need to design the human into the system. And a key aspect of this is making sure that the design of the cab supports and optimizes driver performance and safety. So we thought we'd just talk about a couple of very quick historical examples from the aviation industry where the design didn't fully take into account human performance characteristics and limitations. So some of you might remember the Air France Flight 447, which crashed in 2009. And I think it really outlines what can happen in the event of a sudden change in the mode of operation. And in this case, an unexpected handback of control to the crew. So in this instance, the autopilot was disabled by a failure of the airspeed indicator that had frozen over. And the crew were unable to gain control of the aircraft, which crashed following a stall. The cockpit voice recording transcript that you can see on the left-hand side, I think really highlights the crew's confusion as they were trying to fly the aircraft manually, which was something they didn't actually do that often mid-flight, and trying to make sense of information that was relating to a system failure that was being presented to them through various instruments in the cockpit that was quite difficult for them in that particular context to understand. And the flight ended up crashing into the Atlantic, and everybody was killed on board. So again, really highlights the importance of understanding human performance and our limitations and the context in which we're going to be operating, and then how best we can design our cockpit or our cab environment to support good performance. Just maybe one other very quick example before we talk about a rail one. So this is a B-17 Flying Fortress, Second World War bomber plane. Shortly after being introduced, they experienced something like 450 accidents in a very short time period as a result of landing with the landing gear up. And at the time, blame was put squarely on the pilots. It was a pilot error. Pilots were being retrained and being told to do better. But after analysing these accidents and speaking with pilots who were actually operating this aircraft, it was actually realised that it was more of a cockpit design error. So the landing gear and wing flap controls were almost identical, and they were co-located on the instrument panel. So just on the right-hand side, that image with the two red rectangles is just showing you the switch for the landing gear on, I think, the left, and on the right-hand side is the wing flap control. So they're almost identical and next to each other on the instrument panel. And as a result of this, we've learnt in aviation, we now have modern aircraft with landing gear controls that are shaped like a wheel, and a flap controls that are shaped like a wing flap, this idea of shape coding. So a really good example of designing for the human operator and making sure that we help support good safety performance. Now we're going to talk about a rail one.
So designing for humans and what we know about normal human limitations, as Anthony just said, and our propensity to error in the rail industry. So as an example, on the 24th of July in 2013, a high-speed train on its way from Madrid to Ferrol derailed on a sharp curve. So the train was travelling at twice its permitted speed of 80 k's an hour. 80 people were killed and 144 injured. So a year on, newspaper headlines about the deadly train crash reflected a very predictable outcome. Confirmed, human error caused horror train crash. The driver was reported to have been on the phone talking to colleagues just before the crash. And in isolation, this piece of information immediately primes us to believe the driver is solely to blame. The train was clearly derailed as a direct lack of attention. But from a human-centred design perspective, what were the safety systems in place to prevent an individual driver distraction, which is a known human error, from derailing a train in the first place? If we consider the environment of driving at high speeds, there is a greater need to display information to the driver electronically within the cab. The high-speed train was equipped with ETCS and running high-speed trains which would normally use this system. However, the organisation had switched off the onboard ETCS in 2012, citing operational problems, and it was not working on the day of the crash. On the approach to the curve, ETCS, had it been fully functioning, would have started to alert the driver of the transition several kilometres before. A short while later, a message with a very difficult to ignore yellow flashing frame would have emitted an audible signal. The driver would then have been asked to acknowledge this by tapping on the screen, and after 5 seconds, the brakes would automatically have been applied until an acknowledgement had been received or the train had stopped. In other words, designing ETCS and its notifications in the cab was exactly for the sort of scenario the driver found himself in that day, approaching a curve at high speed and at risk of succumbing to distraction, which is a very ordinary human failing.
Okay, so what do we mean when we're talking about human-centered design, and how do we actually apply this to a change such as the introduction of a new in-cab signalling system? So human-centered design, it's an approach to system design that seeks to make systems usable, efficient, and safe. And it does this by focusing on the end users, their needs, expectations, and requirements, and then by applying appropriate human factors methods, knowledge, and techniques to the design process. For anyone really keen, there is an ISO standard 9241 that describes this process in a lot of detail. The image provided here is just a high-level overview of the basic process, which in simple terms starts with an explicit understanding of the context in which people work. It then seeks to identify and specify user requirements, which you can then feed into the development of design concepts and solutions, which are evaluated against your user requirements through an iterative design process to then ultimately identify the design solution. So I guess the overarching philosophy here is that it really places the human at the center of the design process to help optimize that human performance in the system. And it's really important for lots of reasons, but one of those is that it's actually really expensive if we have to come in later and make a lot of changes on a project. So essentially what this graphic here is showing us is that money and time and resources that we spend upfront in design almost always pays off because it helps us to avoid those expensive changes later. So if we've already built the thing and then we have to go and make a lot of changes, that's really costly. If we can make those changes through an iterative process early on, that's obviously a much more effective way of going about a project design.
So how do we integrate human-centered design approach into a large-scale engineering project? So on this slide, you can see a typical engineering V approach to design and the implementation of change. The left side of the V represents design stages, where a large amount of human factors work and the bulk of our user-centered design occurs. The right side of the V represents the validation of design. Risk approach, human factors integration, the risk is that human factors integration is often delayed to those right side stages, whereas if we focus, as Anthony just showed on the last slide, on human-centered design during the left side stages, we can help avoid costly rework later. So during that concept design, we try to understand and specify the context of use. We develop a human factors program scope and an integration standard, and we review relevant standards and current systems to identify the gap of the change coming in. During those design stages of the project, our human factor activities focus on specifying user requirements for new design, gathering input, conducting design reviews with those who will use the new design system and processes, what we term our end users, and undergoing specific human factor core activities. So everything from task analyses, workload analyses, error analyses, proof of concepts, mock-ups, and desktop assessments. So as a specific example of employing a human-centered design approach in the implementation of in-cab signalling, let's consider the train cab design. Various modifications to our existing fleet have been required to accommodate the signalling equipment and systems. This includes the integration of a driver machine interface, or what we call a DMI, in the central screen position within the driver's desk, which has necessitated the relocation of the existing driver controls. Additionally, the DMI is a touchscreen interface with various driver interactions that need to occur both when the vehicle is stationary and when it is operating at line speed. Existing fleet at QR pose some unique challenges for the integration of new systems due to those screens being positioned further away from the driver's seat than some of our newer train designs. And in order to implement a cab layout design that would minimise end-user impacts and ensure design and procedural consistency, in addition to optimising the safety and performance of the solution we were putting in there, we've done a lot of human factor activities encompassing those human-centred principles throughout the design process. So some of those principles have included consideration for consistency where possible with the existing cab layout to minimise the scope for error as a result of negative transfer, consideration for the physical characteristics of drivers to make sure all the necessary touch points are within comfortable reach, ensuring the driver has good visibility out of the cab, complying with standards, ensuring controls are assessed to their importance and frequency of use, so placing safety critical information directly in front of the driver, and then grouping controls by function and sequence of use to help make interactions more intuitive and less prone to error and inadvertent operation. And for new and relocated controls, consideration for the potential impact of environmental factors such as glare, reflection, and noise. Our human factor activities have included a series of desktop reviews and analyses, followed by low and high fidelity mock-ups. Of greatest significance, a working DMI has been installed into the driver's cab, allowing drivers to be hands-on with equipment during multiple scenarios and to provide feedback in real time. This human-centred approach has led to further safety and environmental considerations and an iterative design process over 6 to 12 months, culminating in a final design that now forms the benchmark for the human-machine interface fitment and driver's cab redesign throughout the project. So as you can see here, our early activities focused on low fidelity mock-ups, so providing the opportunity for end users to give feedback and informed design before design was actually placed into the train cab. It's important to note that the design concepts were still in accordance with HF principles and that design was user-centred and not what we call user-led. So the preferred mock-ups presented had been subject to desktop human factors analysis against standards and principles prior to taking them to our end users. The purpose of these early interactive engagements was to present and jointly assess the proposed physical modifications to the driver's desk before installation. Representatives were asked to assess the low fidelity mock-up in the lab on the first day and in an example train cab on the second day, with the focus being to identify the preferred option for the relocation of the existing elements of the driver's desks. So this slide here shows us the preferred layout that was identified as an output of the low fidelity in the lab. And the second stage of this with end user representatives was to take that low fidelity preferred layout from the lab and understand its feasibility in the context of a realistic train cab environment. So following this, the preferred layout was refined. And this slide shows us a summary of the changes to the cab desk following those early engagements. So I won't go through all of it, but you've got the DMI introduced in the centre panel there and some other things relocated, public announcement buttons from the right panel to under the internal communications interface or the telephone you can see there. Vigilance buzzer relocated from the centre panel to under the left interface. I think a good example here of where human factors principles have met with end user input was probably the reordering of the tile lights. So the tile lights are illuminating indicators. Their purpose is to draw the driver's attention and to indicate a status. So for example, if the slip slide button illuminates, it indicates that there's a wheel slip slide occurring. The existing position of those lamps was within optimal line of sight, whereas the relocated position was around 15 to 35 degrees to the right within what's called the primary line of sight. The proposed relocation was deemed acceptable at a desktop level as the lamps could still be viewed without requiring the driver to move their head. However, based on that principle we referred to earlier of placing controls according to importance and frequency, and combined with the input we had from our end users in those early activities, the tile lights were reordered so that the most critical and frequently used were located closest to the driver's sightlines. And there you can see the final design at construction in the cab.
So one of the things that we touched on previously, and one of the challenges that was facing us was the fact that we had quite a deep cab design, as you can see here from this top-down image. So quite a lot of work had to be undertaken to establish whether this was going to pose a problem, in particular because the new DMI is a touchscreen that the driver needs to interact with at various times. And so to assess this, we had to establish what we call reach envelopes for the driver to understand and for us to be able to understand whether they would be able to reach all of those controls appropriately. So this was, first of all, done at a desktop level, and anthropometric mannequins were developed using an anthropometric database to create reach envelopes for the 5th percentile female through to the 95th percentile male drivers. And we did this from what we called a normal or assumed normal driving position. We also had to reference the National Code of Practice, the prevention of musculoskeletal disorders from performing manual tasks at work for the assessment of the driver posture when interacting with the DMI and the frequency of interactions with the screen. And through this process, we found that it did not exceed any of those risk thresholds that would have triggered potential further action, which was good. But while this desktop analysis gave us confidence that the reach was looking okay, it was all based initially on this anthropometric data modelling, and we had to make some assumptions around that normal driving position and so on. So therefore, we really had to go and validate this with end user representatives in a real cab environment. So that's what we did. So here we've got a couple of photographs here with some representatives from our cab committee. So left-hand side, we've got a 5th percentile female and I think a 95th percentile male on the right-hand side. And importantly, we got them to actually interact with locations on the screen where they would actually be required to touch, if they were driving and interacting with this system for real. So that was able to sort of demonstrate and validate that we'd actually got those reach envelopes okay, and that actually we didn't have any major concerns here in terms of reach. And the introduction of an entirely new DMI meant that we also had to consider the potential for any glare or reflection that could be experienced by the driver on that display. So we did this over the course of, I guess, 3 key activities. The first of which we called a pre-screening. And the purpose of this activity was to identify any potential environmental conditions where there was an increased likelihood that glare or reflection could be experienced on the DMI. And for this static pre-screening, we used an artificial light source to simulate natural light entering through the cab at different angles through the windscreen that corresponded to this grid that you can see on the screen at the moment. So this grid was divided into 4 quadrants, and then each quadrant contained 4 additional locations where the light was to be shone. So this made 16 different points, I guess, through the windscreen in total. So the artificial light source was shone through the screen. We had an HF specialist present in the cab to view and document the level of any glare that might be experienced on the display. And the results from this pre-screening activity suggested that we had a few issues, or fairly minor, but a few issues around the middle part of that display. So then what we did was we went out and did some actual in-cab yard testing. So in this particular sort of phase 2 part of the approach, we had a train positioned statically in the yard to allow for user feedback on the experienced glare at these prioritized angles from the pre-screening activity. And this time we used natural light from the sun to simulate those worst case scenarios. And then from that activity, we made a few minor modifications and went out to do actual dynamic testing on the main line. And that final phase of testing for glare and reflection involved end users driving the train during some identified lighting conditions. So we targeted low early morning sun, which would come through the bottom of the windscreen, and then a low afternoon sun through a different part of the screen. And so then through this process, it was concluded that the installed minor changes that we'd made, an anti-glare film and a couple of other things, combined with the ability to adjust the brightness settings on the interface, were sufficient to mitigate those glare and reflection conditions, even in the worst case conditions of driving directly into the sun. Okay, so in summary, I guess the introduction of in-cab signalling and this ETCS system does introduce a number of complex human factors challenges, particularly around some of those changes that we needed to make to the cab layout and design. I think we've been able to demonstrate that the application of a human-centered design can help optimize human system performance. And through the work that we've done on the cab upgrades, I think we demonstrated that it can be successfully integrated as part of a systems engineering V process as well. And I guess we thought we'd finish just with a few key takeaways that we found really useful. So first of all, spend the time up front to properly understand who your end users are, the direct and indirect end users, their context of use, and how they're actually going to be interacting with this new system. Make sure you engage with them early and frequently. So get them to input into the design, test and evaluate, do it through in-lab, static, dynamic, do that iterative design process. Start with low fidelity and then gradually increase the maturity of the design. And then I guess lastly and ultimately, make sure that HF is not a tick box. It's really costly if we get it wrong. And there are obviously a lot of impacts on timelines and project costs if we have to come back and do major reworks later on. We thought we'd just finish maybe with a quote from Dr. Singh, the Director of Systems Design at the Earth Institute, which says, "We spend a lot of time designing the bridge, or maybe in our case, the tunnel, but not enough time thinking about the people who are crossing it." And I guess the implementation of a human-centered design process and practices in projects hopefully ensures that we do. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Anthony and Bryony, for that very interesting presentation. If anyone has any questions, please pop those in the Q&A. I'll start you off with one that we got in the chat. How do you assess the balance between user requirements and functional considerations, looking back to that Spanish high-speed crash as well? Identify what your requirements are for the train, as well as those for the user, and then getting a successful design out of that.
Yeah, I can start. Oh, I was about to unmute myself and I realized we're off my computer. So I guess it's, yeah, so a lot of the project has off-the-shelf products is what they're called. So trying to make sure that you retain the safety elements of something that's been through rigorous testing, but then also consideration for the context in which we are implementing that safety system. So in the instance of the train crash, the Madrid train crash, I was using it as an illustration of how the ETCS system can assist the human in that way. So providing, you know, what we know are normal human errors regarding distraction or attention, the system actually, you know, provides things like audible alerts, flashing colours, things you have to acknowledge, otherwise a service break is applied. So all those system elements are built around that anyway. And then when you put it in the context of a specific railway, I guess it's, is there anything different about driving a train or a particular train at Queensland Rail where we need to think about those elements of the system and how they will work specifically within what we already have, and do we need to make any changes without compromising the safety elements of the system? Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I'll probably just add as well that for us, you know, and I think we pointed to one of the examples here, we had, you know, what could be considered to some extent a bit of an off-the-shelf system, but making it so that it was fit for purpose for our context was where we had some additional challenges. So things like that deep cab design, that was a legacy issue that we had to deal with, and we had to do a lot of additional analyses around that. And there are other elements to that, which are, you know, things like, you know, can you actually still read all of the text and all of that sort of stuff? So a lot of additional work, which we didn't talk about, you know, touched on some of those sort of font size, readability, all of that sort of stuff as well. So it's taking those systems and then being able to fit them into the context of use for your particular operations. So a lot of the time spent up front, I think establishing that context of use pays off a lot further downstream in the project, I think.
Yep. One quick one, is the layout user-friendly for left and right-handed drivers? How do you accommodate that?
There's no such, well,
the universal question.
There is such thing as a left and right-handed driver, but they have to have their left hand on the brake control at all times. So there's no such thing when you're driving a train as being left or right-handed. You have to interact with the DMI with your right hand because your left hand's not allowed to move.
Yeah, and that brake controller didn't really move as part of our design, so some of those elements were retained, and that was also a consideration for us, was making sure that we could establish and maintain that sort of positive transfer, I guess, between different classes of rolling stock, because our drivers will have to drive more than one type of train, so that was a really important consideration as well.
Yep. One for Deb Loates, who's reading my mind as usual, which was really around that the other side of the V and the closing out of human factors issues, and maybe even leaning into sort of that post-implementation review phase. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah,
are you there yet?
No. I guess the right side of the V, you know, is that iterative design. So once we've actually got design constructed, you're looking at testing and commissioning, and how do you look at the human to system elements during that testing and commissioning phase. So, you know, once we have a fitted train, where do we take it that we have, you know, wayside ETCS track equipment, and how can we do over and back testing, which is what currently goes on, to look at whether all the systems talk to each other, but then also those human system elements to make sure that everything we've done low fidelity and on paper and, you know, in a lab with end users then actually works in the context of a day of operations where it's a bit messier and you've got prioritising to do and competing tasks and that sort of thing. So that would be the main bit of the V, and as we get to post-implementation, I will let you know, because generally not in contractor scope, so that will then fall to me.
I was going to say
but we're not there
yet.
yet.
Might be a presentation for another time.
Yeah.
I might come back and give an
Yes.
update on how it's all gone.
I'll give you one last question and then we'll wrap up. What methodologies have you used when integrating human factors into real life test cases, particularly looking at driver workload and that interaction with the DMI?
Ooh.
Is that something you looked
I'm thinking how much of this I can answer. Tick, tick, tick.
I guess thinking about methodology rather than
Yes.
necessarily findings. So how did you
Yes.
approach that?
Well, I mean, methodology. So we have contractor teams for the Cross River Rail project. So each of them have HF specialists. So how they approach things is then my job to look at from an assurance perspective, whether we think they've provided a robust methodology to provide us evidence so far of that we've looked at things. But workload is a difficult one for things that are new coming into an organisation, because a lot of the time you need to look at predictive measures. So baselining what we currently have, I guess, and then looking at what that gap is and how we can predict what workload will look like under the new system. Because as Anthony said right near the beginning of that presentation, bringing in automated systems is not as easy as comparing apples with apples, because sometimes it changes work in a way that you might think takes away some of your tasks, but it just changes your tasks or can change the nature of the role, which sometimes increases workload just differently, if that makes sense. So you're comparing apples and oranges now, which makes it harder to look at.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your presentation today. That was super interesting.
No worries. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, we're going to shift on to our fourth technical presentation for the day. Our next presenter is Dr. Tara Casey, who's the Senior Manager for Human Factors at Sydney Metro. Tara brings over 22 years of human factors experience to transport, major works, infrastructure, digital systems and stations design projects. Her expertise promotes safe user experience, robust assurance practices and drives design innovation. She's worked for a diverse range of clients both within Australia and the UK, project managing multidisciplinary teams and integrating human factors into complex projects within and outside of the transport industry. Welcome, Tara, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona, for the warm introduction. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide an understanding of some of the methods that my team and the suppliers at Sydney Metro have been using. Such insights will help benefit your application of execution of HF analysis, whether either minor or major projects. I would say it's probably targeted at early career professionals and those who are new to human factors. And for those of you who are familiar with these processes, I look forward to debating and any questions towards the end. So what are you going to learn and when are you going to hear it in this presentation? Well, the agenda is to give you a brief understanding of how HF is structured at Sydney Metro. Next, we will explore what is a mock-up and what we actually mean by fidelity. Midway through the presentation, I will invite you to consider some examples that we have used at Sydney Metro, and you may also find worth considering for your own V&V lifecycle. Finally, I will leave you with some good to know items as I summarise to a close. Many times today, you probably would have heard the definition of human factors. I simply want to proffer that in my time, I've learnt to simply explain human factors as the knowledge of the mind and body. And as such, our areas of concern at Sydney Metro are around safety, usability, efficiency, and effectiveness across our products, people, and processes. I work for a division known as Engineering, Design and Assurance, acronym being EDA. That's where human factors is positioned within Sydney Metro. We are a GO4 automation, so what that simply means is that we have the highest form of automation at the moment. We have driverless Metro. We don't have any drivers in the cab. We do have customer service assistants who are trained to intervene and take over in an emergency situation should they need to, but there is nobody in the cab driving the train, and as such, our cab cubicle is very small, just with the DMI. So that's a key difference I do want to highlight. And so therefore, our command and control centres are probably the heart and brain of our metro, and that's where most, if not all, management of the rail is taking place. What are we doing in terms of human factors? Well, since I've joined a few years ago, I have developed the Human Factors Standard for Sydney Metro. If anybody is keen to read this, I'm happy to send this on outside of the forum. My contact details will be at the end of the slide, should you want to drop me an email. So in terms of engineering, what we do in terms of human factors is just biomechanical human engineering, which simply means our anthropometric mannequin modelling, and the outputs tend to support our collaboration with our UX team and our engineers and architects. For the design elements, we tend to focus on human-centered design, and this tends to be end-user scientific calculations and evaluations, such as trials. And again, this incorporates collaboration with our architects and engineers. This accumulates into our assurance evidence, and this tends to be focused on human risk and safety, making sure that our mitigations and controls have actually taken into account behavioural controls and mitigations, not just simply functional. And the outputs tend to be a human factors issues log and evidence of compliance and tracking. And our compliance is led by our collaboration with our safety and systems assurance team. So what do we mean by verification and validation tools at Sydney Metro, and what do we mean by low to high fidelity mockups? Everything we do is evidence-based. Our role of mockups is to test the reality, whether that's to enhance or change the design. Why is testing the reality important for us? That's because we want to make sure that we're replicating the user interaction as much as possible before the delivery, so that we can actually get the benefit realizations described earlier. So effectively, it's a tool for testing and evaluation, similar to what you would find in an industrial design product development lifecycle. Mockups can be wireframes, cardboard, augmented reality, virtual reality, or even physical prototypes. They can often provide control conditions so that you can actually test your evaluation and your product without interference from confounding variables. And also gives you the opportunity to make changes in real time, amending the design or product on the basis of user-centered feedback in real time. What is fidelity? The level of realism of the prototype and how well it's designed to reflect how the user will actually interact with the system. The more immersive the prototype is or markup is, the higher the fidelity it will have. It should also allow for the user to be able to act out the performance and tasks so that they can be measured. And depending on the life cycle, low tends to be used on the earlier stage of design, and medium in the middle, and then high towards the end. And I'll explain that in more detail as I come to the next few slides. Very simply, verification is often looked upon as, are we doing the right thing? And in that instance, when is it best to use a mock-up and what type of mock-up? As I mentioned, the low fidelity is best at earlier stages because the design is not mature, and the amount of rendering you would have to produce when the design is not mature doesn't make it cost-effective tool to use. So go for a low to medium fidelity tool at the early stages. This allows for chauffeured prototyping and rapid prototyping techniques, where you can be very agile with your users and explore different options if they give you preferences in certain features, for example. Validation is simply, have we done the right thing? This tends to be, if not mid through life cycle, towards the end, even testing and commissioning. High fidelity tends to be, at this point, maybe 60% into the design, and it needs to be a fully immersive application. It can be used as a demonstration tool also with stakeholders. And again, I'll revisit this point because I do want to make the distinction between using a mock-up for user testing versus using a mock-up for stakeholder engagement. So here's an example of a wireframe. This is not a Sydney Metro example, but it's just to give you a flavour that they don't have to be high infidelity, that a wireframe can be two-dimensional schematics or a blueprint, but the essence is that it's actually giving you the understanding of the foundation elements and the structure of the product. And you've seen examples already from Anthony and Baroni's presentation earlier. Here's an example of a low fidelity mock-up. So we had an issue where we were concerned about the space proofing of a viaduct on one of our projects. This is one of our segments, and we had a 2D diagram from our HF team that indicated actually maintainable fit. But the concern I had was the end-to-end user task. So on approach, getting in, turning around and going back out again. The 2D image won't show this. So the team quickly mocked up in cardboard a segment, and as you can see, it's quite lo-fi. They've used canisters to replicate different features of the assets, and it is cardboard. It went up within an hour or two and easily into the office. It was cardoned off and replicated the task beginning to end. So here's an example of something that didn't take much time or cost, but it really did enable us to close out this issue that was open for some time in terms of our deliverables, but also preventing closed out for our next stages of design to give the evidence to our end users that this had been actually addressed. High fidelity mockups tend to be often in Sydney Metro used in gaming platforms, something called Real Engine. And here's an example of where we used a combination of a cardboard distribution board and a very immersive VR that was replicated, that allowed our users to use headsets or gaming controls to actually interact with a station environment that was rendered in VR, and then some distribution boards in cardboard. So it was a combination. The next, and probably the more prevalent, is something called augmented reality. And here's an example from HS2. And this is where augmented reality is basically a hybrid of using physical, actual physical furniture, but also overlaid with virtual reality that, again, tends to be highly immersive and not really low fidelity, but more high. And if you're using gaming platforms like Real Engine and other platforms that allow that immersiveness, it can be a more cost-effective tool for mockups. This is because the rendering time it takes to replicate the station or a rolling stock can often take up to 2 weeks. But if you're actually using augmented reality, you're making use of existing prototypes or existing products with the overlay of augmented reality and allowing the user to interact and manipulate the design. The next is during our testing and commissioning phase or our validation phase, we often tend to have a full-scale mock-up. Now, this isn't one from the current full-scale mock-ups that we have at Sydney Metro. I'm afraid I can't actually share those at the moment because they're under probity. But from a very similar supplier that we've got currently, this is an example of theirs from Moscow. And as you can see, this is pretty much the cab or part of the rolling stock that's been replicated, and it allows fully immersive testing with end users, but also, as I mentioned, it's a good opportunity to, as a show and tell for our engagement team to come and actually look at the systems, but also explain to our stakeholders through stakeholder engagement exercises and visitors in terms of the products that Metro is securing. But again, as I said, this isn't the Sydney Metro example, but a good example of a full-scale physical mock-up. This tends to be probably about 60% into design going forward. You certainly wouldn't have this in the early stages. It wouldn't be cost-effective to do that unless it was a like-for-like design of a similar product that you were actually procuring. So at this point, and I know because you would have heard previously in other presentations, what is the role of HF and, why is it important that we're involved? And often we will find that because of value engineering and budgets, sometimes the testing is often done by the engineering team who actually run the VR model, or actually the designers who've designed the physical prototype. But there are pros and cons to that. And anyone outside of the forum not understanding human factors, this would be seen as an effective verification or validation exercise, but what's missing is the rigor and robustness. The more complex the project, there is that risk that you're perhaps not covering a false up argument. So I wanted this broken down in a little bit more detail to give anyone who's having those internal discussions, trying to explain the value of having a HF as part of the VR mockups or any mockup testing. A HFSME will help give practical and suitable methods, and this will be shown in your human factors integration plan or test plan. You'll also understand the user needs, and because of that, you will have a HF user requirements register. And this is all even before you've got to your mock-up testing. You're laying down the groundwork because you know your user and you understand the methodology that you'll be undertaking. For you to be able to actually address the assessments is going to be faster. Also, you'll be in a better position to predict performance because you're understanding the user tasks, either through a task analysis and also through user trials and mock-ups. You'll come to understand actually how the user are interacting with the system. More importantly, you'll know actually how to measure the performance. This is probably where I have seen other projects perhaps not capitalize on that real richness that a HF professional can bring, and that is the understanding of the range of methods at our disposal and the range of techniques at our disposal. Picking the right technique at the right time for the right evaluation will mean that you're not masking any errors, but you're actually picking the right tools and picking the right data analysis that supports the results, and also what does it mean in terms of requirements. And that's the next point I wanted to raise. We've seen some great mock-ups in the past, certainly at Sydney Metro and in my other roles across my career in 23 years, but often we can find ourselves in a very short amount of time to then explain what that means. And these great assessments sometimes cannot lead to iteration or ideation of the design because that translation just simply hasn't happened and those user requirements haven't been derived or extracted. And then that leads to holes and gaps in your evidence of integration. And in this instance, your test reports and HF assurance reports will be tracking that. And more importantly, your user requirements would have compliance statements in there, and your human factors issues logs would have then open items to show where that mitigation hasn't been addressed or if there's results that haven't been incorporated. So there is a role for HFSMEs in mock-up testing. It's not just simply relying on a VR or an engineer to run those tests for you. It's very symbiotic, and it's important that the HFSMEs give them that chance to be involved, to plan, to conduct, to analyze, and then interpret. What's good to know? Well, I would definitely recommend a few tips in the time I've been running evaluations and what I've seen in terms of lessons learned with the suppliers. Definitely consider different type of mock-ups to provide flexibility in your program. We often find so many test plans coming and saying we're just going to use virtual reality. And as I mentioned, virtual reality has a place in mock-ups and prototyping. But if you're rendering for 2 to 4 weeks to recreate a design, and actually you already have some form of product feature or a prototype, there's no reason why you have to go down the VR route. But also you have BIM and Navisworks sometimes, which is an architectural fly through, and that doesn't actually enable interaction with the system, but also doesn't actually allow recording of performance either. If you have a mock-up that's been engineered that allows automatic recording of performance, so your analysis and the processing around the data can be automated, you are actually finding some wins in terms of the time management around your whole testing. So do really think outside the box. Don't always go to a VR is my advice. Also, program the development time that your mock-up testing will need in terms of integrating the results afterwards. This is where I feel a lot of the time we're losing the benefits of the results. We're just not allowing for that ideation that architects would need or engineers would need once you actually give them the results or the requirements. Definitely secure any specialist development team. So if you're using specialists who are going to be giving you the prototypes through a gaming platform and you are not a specialist on how to run that session, you have to book them in. There is a cost associated with that, and definitely don't forget train the trainer. So if you're needed to learn the system on how to drive it, then factor that time in as well in your program. Always pilot your mock-ups before end user testing. Again, we can lose some vital time when the kit hasn't been tested or run through before the actual user testing, and that often means that we have to cancel sessions and it can cost money when we're actually paying for customers potentially. I would also caution regarding digital reality. Again, VR has a place and it's very popular, but the specialist software sometimes means it can lead to motion sickness, especially with more older users. So try and provide different input devices and controllers, such as hand controllers. It doesn't always have to be headsets, for example. And at this point, I really want to stress, and it's easy when there is a great mock-up that's being developed that many multidisciplinary teams will then want to use and capitalize the system so that they can also use it for their purposes. So often we can forget that there are others like stakeholder management professionals who also need mock-ups or some form or physical prototype that they can use to engage visitors and other stakeholders. So definitely make sure that the delivery managers, project managers are very clear the difference between user testing, which is with the end user, versus stakeholder demonstration with the type of mock-up session that you're programming. I have seen this confused in the past where sessions have been run with a stakeholder or a visitor. It's been user-led rather than user-centered, and often that has been the project manager's version of a human factors assessment. So it's really incumbent on the HFSME to make that distinction very clear, but also to make sure that it's all the kit is booked in for the right assessments. That doesn't mean to say that you hog all the VR and mock-ups and physical prototypes. There's definitely an opportunity to share that with stakeholder management teams, and it will also benefit in terms of stakeholder management going forward. So definitely factor that in and have those discussions early on. And it's good to know, and it's quite refreshing to see that ISO 9241 is actually drafting a standard on what the guidance on interactions with immersive environments such as augmented reality and virtual reality will be. It's called Part 820. For those who haven't had a chance to look at it, it is in draft form. I was able to contribute comments to it a few months ago, and from what I saw, it's looking very promising, and hopefully that will be released fairly soon to the market, but also to practitioners through the various platforms like SIA Global. So do keep an eye out for this standard. I think that definitely will help answer a lot of questions that people often have. When do we use mock-ups? What type of mock-ups and what level of immersiveness is required in terms of fidelity? In summary, as I close, today I've explained what a mock-up is, and in order to actually help you create a simulation of your product or process before procurement, there is benefits of using mock-ups or prototypes. Fidelity relates to how immersive the mock-up is to allow users an enactment of the task and behavior. Low fidelity is useful at early stages of the design. It supports rapid prototyping. High fidelity is useful at more detailed stages of the design, and it supports validation and testing processes with end users, as well as doubling up as demonstration tools for visitors or stakeholders. Now, I'm referring to them as innovative tools today, but we all know that in the digital industry, things move very fast and innovation tends to become obsolete very quickly. So really the true innovation, I would argue, is you will see from this presentation, it's the smart application of these tools during the project lifecycle and not necessarily a flashy prototype. So I hope that's something that you can take away from today and think about how this could be applied to your projects outside of this forum. Anyone who wants to contact me, I'm at Sydney Metro. My details are here and they'll be circulated later on, I'm sure, as part of the presentation packs. But I'd love to hear from anybody who's interested in getting in touch regarding the Sydney Metro standard, if anybody is interested in reading that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. That was really interesting. And absolutely, cardboard mock-ups can be innovative as well. I've got a couple of questions for you, a little bit of time to get through those. One question that's come through about a comment that you made in the chat a little bit earlier, actually, around the CSAs who might operate the driverless metro train in an emergency. I guess the broader question is, how can mock-ups help, I guess, in a situation to evaluate tasks that are perhaps infrequent, rather than something that's, you know, being tested as part of day-to-day operations that people can be doing all the time. Can you talk a little bit to how they could be used in that scenario?
Yeah, so what we tend to do, and again, it's a good question, actually, whoever's asked that question.
That was Marty.
We look at different, okay, thank you. Very good question. I would always recommend testing different modes of operation. So normal, degraded, and emergency. Put that into your test plan. And in degraded and emergency modes, you can actually engineer a scenario where somebody has to intervene in an emergency in terms of there's been a failure and the CSA has to come in and take over. So that can be replicated through a mock-up without putting the end user at risk, because you're using a script to explain to them the scenario and then talking them through a chauffeured process effectively. So as long as you do different modes of testing, you should be able to look at those tasks where they have to intervene and then measure their situational awareness, the type of techniques you use. So you might use Guy Walker's situational awareness data and the scales that he's recommended, or you might look at workload as well in terms of NASA TLX or other suitable workload assessments. Given that this is a GO4 product, it's largely automated, so there's a lot of supervisory role to this product. So the situational awareness doesn't tend to be 100%, but that's not to say that in emergency mode that recall won't be there. So that's something that we definitely do look at, because it's an infrequent task, but are people likely to recall this during an emergency mode? And that has implications for the number of trainings they have, but also the repeat of the training. So I would say you can find a way to measure if you look at different modes of operation.
Yeah, and as you say, I guess there's the testing in the first place, but then the training program afterwards, which would be linked to an RBTNA around frequency of performance of the tasks and all of those kinds of things. Ben has thrown in a two-parter. We'll see how you go with this one. Part one, how do we increase buy-in and advocacy at a senior level in organisations to ensure that human factors people are able to work? Part one. And then part two, how do you then overcome challenges associated with not being able to talk to or involve users at an early enough stage because of things like NDAs and contracts and all those kinds of things?
Okay, part one. I'm probably a classic example on this, Ben. So what I have learned in my lifetime in this field is perhaps explaining the most complicated elements of human factors in the most layperson way possible. And often in our human factors world, we're so used to speaking human factors language with each other. And a good litmus test is if you actually influence champions to go and sell that message for you. And I found that a few champions who really believed in human factors, when I started to talk to them and explain to them the benefits and the whole element of it, that they actually started to sell human factors internally and championed it. They could see the value, the merit, and it was, again, explaining what we do, why we do it, and speaking in the most simplest words. So earlier in the presentation, I said human factors is the knowledge of the mind and body. A lot of you would have disagreed with that. All of you would have had different, a lot of you would have interpreted that differently and gone, oh, actually, I think human factors is this, this, and this. But when I'm talking to somebody who's not a human factors specialist, I have to think about what is the most simple way to communicate this in headline messages that doesn't cause their head to explode. So I've definitely had to think about my messaging, my narrative, and really empathizing with what that individual is looking for, because ultimately everyone actually wants the same thing. We're all working for the greater good and we want users to be safe. So that's been fundamental for part one for me that I found. Part two, in terms of getting users engaged earlier, well, Again, I found making that distinction between end users and stakeholders has been effective. AS 7470 does that really well in the definitions. That's been incredibly helpful. And also defining in our requirements. So I've to show how effective it's been having those conversations, I have actually been able to develop almost 9 pages of human factors requirements in our tenders. This is the first time we've had this level of HF on our live projects at the moment. And we have WSA, Western Sydney Airport, where we never had HF to this degree. And that has come through making sure that you stipulate end user engagement early on and all the way through the life cycle, as in terms of every design stage, but making sure that you're using AS 7470 to also promote the fact that there is a case for stakeholder engagement versus end user testing to get that user testing happening early on as part of the verification and validation lifecycle. I hope that's addressed part 1 and part 2 for Ben. Are you mute, Fiona?
Thank you. I'm sure you have. So one last one before we wrap up this section. How do you ensure that the HFI that's used in developing the systems, and I guess from the application of mock-ups, is carried forward in terms of the design of rules and procedures that sort of support the actual operation?
Yep. So there's different mechanisms. If the heart is your human factors issues log, if you've captured it in there and then transferred that issue to a project safety hazard log, safety base, other registers, RADOCs, we find that they get captured all the way through. So as long as you're recording them in your human factors issues register, if it's a safety issue, then you have mechanisms internally to migrate and transition them. And also the tracking of compliance. We simply don't just close off issues when you get to the end of the project. There are people holding you to account. And that's certainly a mechanism that has helped us in terms of tracking and making sure the HFI is carried all the way through the life cycle.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Tara, for your presentation. That was really interesting.
No problem. Thank you very much, Fiona. Great sharing as well, by the way, and mediation with
I'm trying. Okay, we're going to take a second quick break now. So you've got one last opportunity for a stretch and a cup of tea, and we'll be starting our final session on investigations at 3:45 sharp, and we'll see you then. Okay. Let's jump into our final session of the day. So our final session is focused on the integration of human factors thinking and methods into the investigation process. We will have an introductory presentation on the topic, followed by a panel discussion with a group of HFSMEs from 3 different rail organisations. First up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Melanie Todd. Melanie is currently Team Leader Human Factors Assessments for Air Services Australia. She has held investigator and management positions with the Australian Transport Safety Bureau and has extensive experience in both regulatory and investigative roles as a specialist in human factors across many safety critical industries. Welcome, Melanie. Over to you to introduce this very exciting topic.
Thanks, Fiona. Just want to check you can hear me okay.
Yep, all good.
Great. So I'll just share my screen. Can you also confirm that you can see that okay?
Yep.
Wonderful. Even better. Okay, thanks for that. And thank you very much for asking me to be part of the forum more broadly today, and the panel specifically this afternoon. It's a very interesting area, and I did enjoy my time as a consultant in rail, so it's nice to see what's happening and get back into what's happening in the HF space there. Okay, so what I want to have a chat about today, just to kick off the panel discussion, is our integration of human factors in investigations. The main thing really that I wanted to just touch on is what we gain from the introduction and integration of human factors into the investigation process. The main thing I think really is a greater understanding of why the event happened. Obviously, the entirety of the investigation process is set up to understand what happened and why it happened. That's kind of obvious. But what we definitely want to drill down on is why it made sense to that person, that individual at that moment in time, to do what they did. So it's very easy to say, oh, you know, they broke a rule, or it was a classic example of operator error. But nobody turns up to work with the idea that today's the day I'm going to violate, you know, today's the day, baby, wearing a t-shirt that says rules are for losers. That's not really how it works. Equally, nobody kind of continues along with what they're doing and goes, you know, there's a 50-50 chance that what I'm going to do is going to result in a bad outcome, but oh, well, I'll give it a go, because that's not how our brains work either. But it is so compelling as a narrative to outsiders in particular, to passengers on trains and aircraft and patients in the healthcare system, to say, well, they really should have known better. This is what we pay them for, and the system's not supposed to go wrong. So that's kind of, I think, the biggest benefit for human factors is really getting to the core of why it made sense to that person to do that. And in all of my time as an investigator, the one thing which kept coming back was that people would say at interview, I wish I had a reason for why I did what I did. I know it doesn't make sense. I wish I had a reason. And most of the time there was a reason, but that reason was explained by the HF side of things. You know, they were distracted, or there was confusing equipment, or they were fatigued, topics we've discussed already this afternoon. HF also gives us an opportunity then to delve into those more systemic issues which can set the next person up for failure. If we go down the path, the attractive path of saying it was the individual, and if we get rid of the individual, we've solved the problem. And I did work with some clients who had that as a starting point, which is not ideal. Then you do lose the opportunity to learn from the greater, learn from that experience to feed into that greater kind of system learning capability. So we can help identify systemic issues that can catch other people out. You know, what is it about the design of the rail yard that is setting drivers up to proceed past the limit of authority? What is it that we're doing that's not helping to support good performance? And in a few cases, we do also have the chance to affect or influence industry-wide change. It certainly is a little rarer, but we can do it. And what I want to do very quickly before the panel discussion is just talk to you about an investigation I was involved in. It is aviation, I'm sorry. It's only because I was an aviation investigator at the ATSB, not a rail one. Otherwise, I'm sure I'd have a rail one for you. But just to show you kind of how we can get that industry-wide benefit from a good, kind of like a good outcome aspect. So the event that I had, and I'm not trying to turn anyone off flying, I need to say at the start that it is still very, very safe. It's very, very safe. There was no bad outcome here in terms of there were no injuries and there was damage to an aircraft, but that was it. But the event that we had was an aircraft departing Melbourne going to Dubai that had a tail strike on takeoff. So this is where the tail has made contact with the runway during the takeoff roll, during the rotation, which is not ideal, obviously, that shouldn't happen, and has then become damaged and couldn't proceed to Dubai. So they had to return to Melbourne, which they did safely. The accident occurred as a result of a data entry error. And this data entry error was a transposition error where the crew entered the weight of the aircraft into the electronic flight bag. And instead of entering 332 for 332 tonne, they entered 232. So the aircraft thought, the electronic flight bag calculated the speeds and thrust settings that were more relevant for an aircraft that was weighing 100 tonne less. The thing that was interesting from a human factors point of view was that this error slipped through 8 independent checks. There were also 4 flight crew on the flight deck. Because it was a 15-hour flight to Dubai, they had the crew that would be providing the rest for the operating crew, so they could get rest during the cruise and be less fatigued for landing. And none of the 4 people on board that night, this happened at 10 o'clock at night or 10:30 at night, none of those 4 crew at the time recognised that the speeds and thrust settings were erroneous. In hindsight, absolutely, and they said that to us. It's obvious sitting here today that that's wrong, but on the night it was not obvious. Now, it would have been really easy for us to say, well, this is an example of pilot error and just stop there. And we had counterparts overseas who did exactly that. There was an event that happened very close to this one, I want to say within kind of 6 months of this one happening, where one of our counterpart agencies released a 4-page report that said, basically, it got through 7 or 8 checks and the operators added another check, so problem solved. We didn't take quite the same tack, as you'll see in a second. What we looked at instead were what were these conditions on the night that set it up so that the crew did not detect that they'd made this error. One of the things we found was that it was normal for them to see these figures on departure from Melbourne. What happened with this service was that it came through from Dubai, so Dubai, Melbourne, they'd swap crew, go Melbourne, Auckland, swap crew, Auckland, Melbourne, swap crew, Melbourne, Dubai. So the first few times that the crew departed Melbourne for Auckland, they were seeing takeoff speeds and thrust settings very similar to what they saw on the night. And the first few times they saw it, their reaction was that can't be right. Double check everything. Over time, of course, you're departing Melbourne, okay, yes, so speeds and thrust settings are correct. For Auckland, yes, but nobody was sitting there going like, oh yeah, I'm sure it's the same. Again, as I said, like this made sense to them, right? So that first safety net of something unusual had been eroded. The other thing we found was that they were cross-qualified across the A330. This happened on an A340-500, but they were also qualified on the A340-300. The reason why that mattered was that these 3, or the 2 A340 variants and the A330 have a wide range of expected or normal, I suppose, takeoff weights and thrust settings and speeds. So their ability as a crew to have a ballpark kind of, we need this thrust setting or we need this speed, that's our kind of ballpark figure, that's our normal, that ability had basically been taken away from them. So that of course was the first thing that people would say, well, they must have known that it was going too slow. Well, no, actually, it wasn't that simple. The other thing was that the operator had introduced an electronic flight bag. So I was really interested to hear Melissa start off the forum talking about that transition from paper to electronic charts or digital charts in healthcare, because this was sort of similar. And one of the things which kept being thrown back at us was, well, this wouldn't have happened with paper charts. Spoiler alert, yes, it would, and yes, it did. However, when we did delve into this a little bit, we said, well, what checks did you do as a crew? And the captain said, well, it's been in place for 4 years. For the first 2 years of its use, I checked the figures every single time, but it was always right. How long do you keep checking something that's always right? At which point I thought, well, definitely not 2 years. Hats off to you. That's quite conchy. But that kind of also indicates that, while people can check and while they do have that reference, that kind of framework to say, look, I know that this might not be what I think it is, and I know I have to be careful, that can only last for so long. And I really think 2 years was above and beyond. So in terms of our broader systemic influence, we decided to have a look at how many other instances of data entry errors could we find globally. So a separate research investigation was done looking at a systemic review of similar events. We found at least 30 events globally in a 20-year period. Most of the time, nothing bad really happened. We think that we thought at the time at least, and it's probably still true, that this is a fairly prevalent error, but most of the time it doesn't matter. And in a twin-engine aircraft, the magnitude of the error would be low enough that you probably wouldn't notice, or maybe it would be slightly slower, but nothing too bad. The other thing that we did find was that this error and this error kind of trajectory and potential occurred independent of aircraft type, the location, or the airline. So exactly the points that were being discussed before in relation to the high-speed train accident. When we're looking at, well, was it the one individual, or was it the airline, or it must be the fact that they allow their crew to fly across different aircraft types, it must be the fact that they were departing Melbourne at night away from lights, it must be the fact that insert reason here. Actually, no, it wasn't. And we also found that this error was prolific through both paper and electronic flight planning formats. So there was no one thing that we could hinge this on or kind of swing it off. And I think that's where a lot of the value from a human factors input to an investigation can occur, because we can sort of bring that more systemic and holistic point and say, look, this is bigger than an individual. This is bigger than one aircraft type, equipment type, train design. We have to look at this sort of a little more globally, if you like. The benefit, because I did say that there was a benefit here, was that many of the Australian airlines, and we sent this, the RISSB sent this report out to every airline in Australia that we thought it would be of use to, basically. Just, check this out, please don't do the same thing. That, it's not a challenge, don't try and do it as well. And they did recognise the potential for it to happen to them. A lot of them use this as a case study, or a variant of this event as a case study in their recurrent training for a while. They updated procedures and flight plan forms to help mitigate against this error. So we did discover a way that you could, it wasn't foolproof. We discovered it wasn't foolproof, but there was at least one check that would help the crew to identify there was an error of this magnitude. And it also helped them to consider, when they were introducing electronic flight bags, what kind of things that they should take into consideration for crew use, for the requirements around design, because now by the time most of the time the airlines, had introduced EFBs, they were kind of using tablets, not laptops, so it did take away some of the issues. In this particular event, part of the problem was that the first officer was entering the data on the laptop and passing it to the captain. There was no independent calculation done by both crews. So a lot of our airlines, or the Australian airlines we sent this to, recognised that as an issue, and so did the operator involved in this event, I should say. So independent checks were a big thing. The actual design of the interface for entering the information, and then those checks and those flows across the flight deck to support the opportunity to detect the error was what they focused on, which gave a lot of value to helping to prevent this sort of thing past that point. So my last point, I suppose, to set up the panel discussion is really, okay, so we can see that human factors can add value. We can see that it can help identify some systemic issues, and it can look at the system more broadly and how the individual sits within it. How do we do it? Well, this is the fun part, right? If I had like one model or one framework or one way of doing it, I would be retired by now. I think I would need to work. There are unfortunately many different approaches. When I say unfortunately, it's actually good. There are many different approaches. Whether or not you have internal expertise, whether you bring that expertise in from a human factors point of view, whether you bring in external human factors support, whether you have it in-house, and how you use it, we will discuss as a panel in a moment. But there are lots of different options, and the great thing about it is that the short answer is the best way to do it is the way that works for you. Don't try and follow a framework or a model that suits a bigger organization or a smaller organization. The best outcome is when you are identifying these issues and addressing them. It's kind of like the same as frameworks and models. Use whatever works. It kind of doesn't matter what bucket it goes into, as long as it gets identified, you then have a chance of actually addressing it. So I think that's probably the stop point for me, and I'll hand back to Fiona to invite the rest of the panel in.
Thank you very much. That was a very good scene setting for us, Melanie. I'd like to invite the rest of our panel to join now to talk through this topic in a little bit more and share the benefits of their personal experience and expertise. Paris Lean is the Senior Manager Human Factors in the DART team at Transport for New South Wales. She's a human factors professional with over 15 years experience, primarily within the rail and transport industry, working both within and outside the government sector, providing consulting services to transport operators, rail infrastructure managers and engineering design suppliers. Dr. Kate Branford is the Human Factors Manager at V-Line, working on activities ranging from providing practical HF advice and recommendations to delivering training and initiating safety improvement projects. Her main areas of interest are incident investigation and promoting a just culture. And Dr. Emily Novatsis is the Head of Operations Safety at Metro Trains Melbourne and a registered organisational psychologist. She has 20 years of experience working predominantly in human factors and safety management roles in safety critical industries, applying a user-centred and pragmatic approach. Relevant to this panel topic, she has led many investigations, run training for investigators on how to apply human factors principles and methods, and in her current role manages Metro's team of on-call investigators. Welcome, panel. I just want to take Mel's most recent point, I guess, about there are many ways, and to get an idea from each of you around what human factors integration looks like in an investigation within your organisations. Is it a human factors person? Is it an investigator applying human factors skills and knowledge? Paris, do you want to kick off how this works for you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, within transport and our rail agencies, we apply a scalable approach. So at all levels of investigations, one thing we've got within the rail agencies is a decision support tool called the Fair Decision Framework. And that helps to ensure that kind of applies just culture principles and helps to ensure that you're looking at the human and system element. So it helps to ensure when we don't have a HF specialist necessarily supporting that investigation, we do have the consideration of the human system interaction. For more complex investigations, we'll have an actual investigations team and a lead investigator. And if there are human system elements that should be reviewed, our human factors team will support, and we'll have a dedicated human factors specialist who will work quite closely with the lead investigator to ensure that we're supporting the analysis of the data and the findings coming out from that. Hand over to the next panel member.
I can go next, Paris. Yeah, so at Metro, I think it's a bit of both. So we try and equip all investigators with a base level understanding of human and organisational factors and what influences human performance. Because that way, even for our lower level events, we can consider, what's influenced performance on the day. Then when it comes to some of our more complex events and serious incidents, we probably have, or we do have, human factors professionals who could join the investigation team. I think not dissimilar to what you're describing, Paris. And that way they can provide more specific input. I think as well where the dedicated HF people come in is where we've got neuro investigators who might need support through an interview to be able to sort of draw out some of the things that might have influenced performance. Yeah, they're probably the main sort of way. So I think it just depends on the level of event in terms of severity.
Anything different for you, Kate, or pretty similar?
Similar-ish. We have certainly provided human factors awareness training to our investigations team so they understand about human factors. But the approach that we take at V-Line is that the human factors people are pretty much embedded into the investigation team. So our human factors team and our investigations team work within the same division. We sit near each other. We work on a lot of activities together and mitigations and those sorts of things. So they understand a lot about human factors. But the approach that we take is that if there's an incident that's got any human factors elements, then I'm the main one who does this because it's my favourite activity. I'll get involved. And what I do is lead the post-incident interviews with the people who were involved and also review the other data collected. And then provide advice directly to whoever the assigned investigator is. So I'll work with the investigation team to provide advice directly. That's what we do in most cases. There have been a handful of incidents where we've needed to do a major investigation for something which has pretty significant human factors kind of elements to it. And in those cases, I've been assigned as the lead investigator. So we'll be doing the investigation myself with support from the rest of the investigation team. So our level of HF input varies a bit depending on the type of incident and what sort of factors there are. But our approach is to always have a qualified HF specialist as part of the investigation team.
You mentioned getting involved to that post-implementation, post-incident interview stage. Is that sort of an indication of how early human factors should be getting involved in the investigation process?
Yeah. Our aim is to get involved as early as possible. So in terms of when do you get involved, our approach is really not even to wait for an incident. What we have to try and do is determine which types of incident are going to need human factors input so that when they come, everybody's ready to go. So our investigation team already know which types of incidents they need to bring us in for, but I'm also I'm monitoring the investigations team chat. I've got it in my background all the time so I can see what's happening and know when I need to jump in. But in terms of our post-incident interviews, they get prioritised over everything. As a lot of you will know, when I've pulled out of meetings at the last minute, we do these at night sometimes. We do them on the weekends. It's via Teams, so it's okay. I can do it in my pajamas. But we prioritise them over all of the other activities because it's so important to get that information quickly before the staff's memory has faded, and also because they have been involved in a stressful event and quite like to get it over and done with. So typically we'll do that on the day of the incident or sometimes on the next day. It's pretty rare for us to do it any later than the day after, which is pretty good. But that early involvement is useful for us because it means that we're involved fast. We can start to identify what the issues are and start digging into those really quickly before the data starts to be corrupted or deteriorate.
Thanks, Kate. I guess one of the benefits that we can add as human factors practitioners is that systems thinking, that systems view. I guess, Emily, to you, how do we ensure that investigations are picking up those systemic issues? We're sort of moving away from the individual pointing at the person at the pointy end stage, but how do we lift it up to be looking at the big picture?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I think there's a number of things there, but the first thing I would draw out is, like with any human factors area, it's about making sure that the requirements are integrated into the safety management system. It's not a separate or add-on or afterwards, and it's no different to the investigation topic. So ensuring that the safety management system has requirements for identifying the systemic aspects of incidents So, for example, that might be through the investigation management procedure and associated guidelines, whatever the relevant, documents are within your own safety management system. And I suppose really, looking at, well, how could a human factors person influence that? They could get involved to give advice on what tools and methods could be, articulated within the safety management system, and how they could be applied and when. Other things would be to ensure that training and coaching is provided to investigators on how to apply those tools and methods to dig into the systemic issues. And that should go to also including providing additional skills on what influences human performance right across from the individual job and the organisational areas. I think another key thing that I know a lot of businesses do, and we certainly do, is to have a causal factors framework. I think when Alison spoke earlier, she mentioned, some of these that have been provided more industry tools, but you can also adapt that for your own business and make sure that causal factors framework essentially has the systemic causes, and there are generic sets of these. We don't need to make them up. There's a lot that exist. And then, a human factors person could help develop that framework and help people apply that framework within the organisation. And I think the last thing I would say is to have a quality review process. So if we're saying that it's in our safety management system and we have to apply it to understand, what's underlying influenced an event, is then have a process in place that you have a quality review of the investigation to ensure that it has picked up on the human and organisational factors elements and those systemic issues. And that can be, quite a formal process. You might not apply it to every incident, of course, because it'll be too time consuming, but maybe just for your high potential incidents or your more serious incidents. Anyway, a few ideas there, Fiona.
Did anyone want to add anything to that?
I think the only thing I would add is that it's also useful, just while we're on that systemic push as well, that sometimes the impetus for getting HF involved is that this is the 7th one of these we've seen, or maybe not even 7th, it's not, I suppose all I'm saying is it's not just the severity or the complexity of the event itself, it can be the trend as well.
Well, I guess that leads into, sorry, I was just going to say that leads in nicely to, I guess, the question of data and how data influences how we get involved in investigations, but also what happens with the output at a systemic level.
Yeah, that's good. And I think you're spot on, Mel. And I probably, it's really important. So to not have a causal factors framework, you don't really have that that ability to actually track changes in a systematic way over time, and to be able to pinpoint what those issues are outside of individuals being able to do that. It needs to be in a system such that they can be tracked by a range of people. And I think it's really, one of the most important things about this is, aside from identifying the issue and then looking back to address that, it's also forward looking to interventions. And I'll give an example that we had here. So we have a SPAD strategy now called PAE strategy. Rail people will be familiar with this, so signal pass at danger, or now proceed authority exceedance. And I was asked to review as a human factors person at the time, well, let's have a look at the SPAD strategy. Are we actually picking up enough on the human and organisational aspects? And so the first thing I did was look to our data in our causal factors framework and pull out, well, when we have these type of events, what are the underlying issues that are influencing? That's the first thing I did. And then I had a look at the PAE plan, or at the time SPAD plan. And what I saw was, in the plan, there was lots of individual initiatives and actions centred at drivers. In fact, it was about 70-something% of the activities were centred at the individual level for drivers. And of course, there's a part to play there. But I thought it was overrepresented when you looked at the data that said, actually, most of the issues are around design and around job factors. So putting those two together, that didn't add up. So what that underlying data of systemic issues for that type of event allowed us to do was to go back to that SPAD strategy and then look at, well, what else can we do that targets some of the design and the job factors to put that a bit, marry that up and make it a bit, that higher, and some of the, keep some of those individual actions, but not have them overrepresented.
Thank you. Mel, I'll go to you. I think all of you have mentioned in some form or another the sort of training, but also the tools that can be used as part of that human factors input to investigations. there's a lot of tools out there. What are the good ones? Are there good ones? How do people access them? Can anyone use them? Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, I can try. So I think in short, there are a lot of different investigation models. You know, you've got Taproot and ICAM, and then there's human factors specific kind of add-ons to those. HFAT, HCAS in the US. You know, there's lots of different approaches of things. Aximaps are very good as well. They all need different skill sets and different levels of familiarity, I would say. They definitely all need training to some level. Some of them are probably more of a generalist approach. Some you need HF for. Some are designed for people to do consideration of the human factors and organisational factors that could be influencing the events. So they are designed for the layperson. I think, again, at the risk of kind of sounding a little cheeky, it is the framework that works for you is the best framework. Like, it's not so easy to say, oh, you should do what the HSB did. Like, we had or they still have a framework that's quite rigorous for a reason, because you know you have a lot of different considerations that go into determination of findings because of the weight they carry in a public setting that doesn't apply to you at an organisational level. Thankfully, it's something you should be thankful for. So you know that approach and that framework and that rigidity of that framework has to be a little bit different, I think, to what you can use as an organisation. So I think the main thing is giving your investigators a base level of understanding of human factors and investigation skills such as interviewing, and having them understand that how they do it is as important as what they do, particularly that kind of, you know, interpersonal skills and interview skills, because we're humans and we can hold a conversation that we can interview, and it's actually not quite true all of the time. So yeah, I think there's no one size fits all. There's no one better than any other. But I think the integration of your tool within your SMS is probably the most important thing, so that it is data driven, as Emily said. You can use it. You've got the causal factors that you can then feed into reporting, and you can track, and it's giving you something meaningful.
Does anyone else want to talk to the approaches or tools that they're using, or their particular favourites?
I can talk through ours.
Or give a scathing review of something. You know, that's just as exciting.
So as some of you know, I'm a bit of an Aximap fan. However, we use ICAM at Beeline, and one of the limitations of ICAM, it's an awesome tool that's got lots of good bits in it. It's got a couple of limitations that are relevant. One of them is it's not very good at looking at the interactions between contributing factors from different organisations, and it's not great at also capturing the external factors that contribute. So it's really kind of the scope of an ICAM analysis really is within a single organisation, which is one of its main limitations if you were trying to use it from a regulatory perspective, for example. But because I'm in a single organisation and our kind of scope of power is within that organisation as well, of what we can change and what we can identify, it actually works really well for us. We have tweaked it a little bit because ICAM is not rail specific, and it's got a lot of examples in there that kind of focus more on generic kind of industrial tasks. So we've had to add a few extra factors in our contributing factors framework, which we use as part of it. But it does work relatively well. It's got the benefit of being pretty quick and easy to learn. Our staff do a 2-day, I think, lead investigator training course, which teaches you how to use it. Plus, I deliver separate interviewing skills training and practice to try and get that side up. So that works all right. The other thing that we do is we've got investigation templates that really help the investigator with what they're trying to do. So they're designed that asks you the question of what you're looking for and what you should be focusing on, and then and prompts you to add those in. And we've got that scalable. We've got 3 levels of investigation template depending on the level of severity of the incident, so that it kind of matches and prompts people to spend the right amount of effort and focus on the right kind of number and scope of changes, but without ever forgetting those systemic ones. Those are in all of the levels.
Paris or Emily, did you have anything extra to add there?
Nothing.
Look, we use. Oh, go ahead, Paris.
Sorry, Emily. No, I was going to say we use ICAM as well. Nothing additional in terms of the tools, just recommendation just to keep your reading broad, just to keep across the investigation reports that are coming out. I know all of this panel, we've all input into some some references that we recommend. So just making sure that you're up to date with those readings, I find them quite helpful.
We also use ICAM here at Metro. And the only thing I'd add to what Kate said, and will emphasise what Kate said, is that that training alone is not sufficient. It needs to be paired with solid interview training, because that's, of course, where all the gold is in understanding what influenced performance on the day. And if we don't equip investigators with that, they'll only get so far.
I'm just going to throw to a couple of questions from the chat and the Q&A. One from Deborah Lotes, unsurprisingly, is about fatigue. Often fatigue is identified as in an investigation, but is left off from a causal factor. It's not captured as a contributing or causal factor because it's difficult to demonstrate influence on the error. How do you make sure that organisations still draw learning from that?
I can jump in here. I can say, make sure you have an in-house expert like we luckily have with Nathan, which is always very helpful. But having, in all seriousness, having education of the organisation into it not just being as simple as a calculated measurement, but actually, that fatigue risk management, taking them on what those processes mean and kind of the likely impacts. So, but our investigations team are all quite well educated on that, and we've got safety, environment, quality and risk, making sure that fatigue is highlighted for review.
I can add a little bit. I agree with all of that. We have real difficulty identifying fatigue as a contributing factor. It's virtually impossible to get the data you need to demonstrate that it is one. But what you can still do is identify it as a possible or likely contributing factor. And also in our investigations, we identify things called other safety factors anyway, which are things that are non-contributory, but nevertheless identified a risk or something that needs to be addressed. So our approach, even if you can't identify it as a contributing factor or you're not sure, if there's enough evidence that there's an issue or the procedures haven't been followed or there's some reason to suspect that you're not setting people up to succeed in their roles by making sure that they've got enough rest and sleep opportunity and all of that. That's something you can identify and address even if you aren't able to identify it as a definite contributing factor.
Thanks, Kate. Probably a good one to finish the discussion on. How do you sell the concept of having a dedicated HF resource? And where would they sit? In governance, in risk, in operations? Does anyone want to talk to that one?
I can probably start it because I find this an interesting area. When I was at CASA, we were kind of sitting more on the so at the regulator, we're probably sitting more on the standard side, and then at the ATSB, I was embedded in the operational teams, and there was discussion over the years about should we be a dedicated human factors team within investigations, or should we be kind of dispersed, and it kept going backwards and forwards. Just had a very similar thing at Air Services where our human factors change assessments team was moved over to the operations side, which I think is good. But I think the short answer is if you, provided that you've made those connections and that you are seen as adding value to the organisation, it almost doesn't matter where you sit. But you do need to do the hard work to prove that you add value and you're not just another hurdle or another way that things are going to slow down or make their life harder.
Can I follow up with just a quick comment on that last bit? I think a trick for HF people who are trying to get more embedded in this area is to make it easier for them to include you than not. So the way I've done that is by being super helpful. Like I do their interviews and I document it for them and I give them a summary and I've identified the contributing factors already, and it's way faster than it would have been if they had to do it without me. So that's a kind of the stealth approach to HF integration.
Incentivize them to include you. Absolutely.
I mean, one way that I'll just comment, Fiona, on, and it's a bit broader, I think, than just investigation. But the way I ran the team at Woodside was we had a number of HF people sitting within the corporate division, which was in the safety corporate division, but then one embedded in each of our main delivery areas. And so I think, and then what we did was rotate them. So almost like second them in and back to the corporate. And so that allowed just that understanding between the standards and the integration we're trying to set within the safety management system, but then, well, how does that actually apply when you do it and you're part of that investigation team, and had that learning, and then we could adjust the SMS if we needed to, and also help keep it real for the people sitting in the corporate area.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze one last one in. We're getting close to time now, but just in terms of, I guess, getting open and honest input from an investigation. Paris, I'll ask you this question. How do you encourage people, particularly with that interview, to give you useful and open information so that you can then get meaningful sort of findings and outputs and change from an investigation?
Yes, sure thing. Keep your investigation process open and honest. So we apply just culture principles, and that ensures that you're not removing the accountability of the individual, but you're recognising that the system plays a big influence in terms of behaviours and performance, and you're wanting to create an environment where it's safe for people to put their hands up. We make mistakes all the time, so it's safe for them to put their hand up. We can talk about it, and as an organisation, we can learn from it, build from it, and actually design quality hazard controls, because that's the end game. At the start, I quickly said that we have a fair decision framework. So that's been brought in by the safety culture team, with the support from human factors, but that's all about ensuring that we're balancing that accountability between the system design and the individual, and it's ensuring that we have a fair and consistent approach across the organisation. Another key component to that was through the design and implementation. That team were actually working with frontline workers and frontline managers to actually ensure that the tool was reliable, it was fit for purpose, but it was also going to be accepted and people were comfortable using it. So that's just a quick summary on us, considering noticing the time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to
super quickly, Fiona, is don't make no promises. Don't make any false promises during the interview or introduction process. That will also work against you.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much, panel. We probably could have talked for a whole other hour, but thank you, Melanie, Kate, Emily and Paris, for your discussion and your shared experiences. That was really interesting. And that brings us an end to our forum today. Thank you to everybody, our presenters, our panelists, everybody who engaged with the session via the chats and the Q&As. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions. We'll try really hard to follow up with the unanswered ones over the coming weeks. If you'd like more information on human factors, we've included that information on the slides. The slides and the presentations will be available. We'll send a link to all of that when we also send out a feedback form, which will be really interested in hearing your thoughts on today's presentation. Thank you to RISSB for hosting us, to Elizabeth Chilton for providing tech and comm support. I'd like to thank my co-organisers, Gareth Hughes, Elena Belcher, Corey Summers and Rachel Smart for helping to curate today's program. Please continue the conversation with like-minded colleagues over a bowl of chips and a beverage if you happen to be close to one of our networking events. And on behalf of the Rail HF Managers Group, thank you for coming along and enjoy your evening.